She looked at him. Worn boots, calloused hands, and a heart too kind for the world. "You deserve better," she whispered, believing he had nothing left to give. He only smiled, silent and steady. Days later, carriages filled the dusty road, and her name was whispered through town. The man she'd once pitied now stood before her, no longer the poor cowboy, but the owner of an empire. And every brick of it he'd built for her. Lightning split the sky like a wound torn open across the belly of the world. The prairie didn't ask permission before it drowned. Rain came down in sheets so thick you couldn't tell where sky ended and earth began, just gray upon violent, howling gray. The wind screamed through the valley like something dying, bending the wild grass flat against the mud, turning the road into a river of churning brown water that swallowed everything foolish enough to stand in its way. And the carriage, God help it, the carriage was foolish. It careened down the rutted trail at a speed no sane driver would have allowed. Two terrified horses, wide-eyed and frothing, hooves slipping in the mud, pulling a worn-out rig that groaned and shrieked with every lurch. The wheels caught in the flooding ruts, jerked left, then right, fishtailing toward the edge where the ravine dropped 20 feet into black, churning water. Inside, a woman screamed. Not a scream of surprise, a scream of someone who knew they were about to die. The carriage tilted, the left wheel lifted off the ground, suspended for one impossible heartbeat over the abyss. The horses reared, tangled in their traces, pulling the whole mess sideways. Wood splintered, metal shrieked. The driver, a young woman in a soaked blue dress, clung to the reins with white-knuckled hands, her bonnet torn away by the wind, dark hair plastered to her face. She didn't let go, even as the wheel touched, back down, and the carriage lurched forward again. Even as the horses bolted toward the ravine's edge in blind panic, she held on. Her voice cut through the storm, commanding the animals with words they couldn't possibly hear, over the thunder, over the roar of wind and water, and her own racing heart. And then, movement in the storm. A rider, dark as the clouds themselves, charging across the flooded field on a bay horse that moved like liquid shadow. No saddle, no bridle she could see. Just a man bent low over the animal's neck, cloak streaming behind him like smoke, riding hard toward the runaway carriage. He didn't shout, didn't wave, just rode. The bay horse closed the distance impossibly fast, hooves throwing up sprays of muddy water, muscles bunching and releasing with the precision of something wild and perfectly controlled. The rider pulled alongside the careening carriage, reached out, impossibly far, impossibly steady, and caught the harness of the lead horse. His hand locked around the leather. The bay dug in its hooves, skidding through the mud. The panicked horses felt the pressure, felt something stronger than their fear, and began to slow. The carriage jerked, groaned, tilted again, but this time the rider held it, pulled it back from the edge with nothing but grip and will, and the raw strength of a man who'd stopped worse things from falling. The wheels settled. The horses stood, heaving, steam rising from their coats. The storm raged on, but everything else had gone still. The woman in the driver's seat sat frozen, rain streaming down her face, her hands still locked on the reins. She stared at the rider through the gray curtain of rain, trying to see his face beneath the wide brim of his hat, beneath the shadow of the storm. But he'd already let go. He turned the bay horse without a word, without waiting for thanks or recognition, and rode back into the storm. Within seconds he was gone, swallowed by the rain as if he'd never been there at all. Only the mud-churned earth and the fading hoofprints proved he'd been real. The woman sat there for a long moment, alone on the edge of the ravine, rain hammering down on her shoulders. Her hands shook, her breath came in ragged gasps. She looked down at the rain still wrapped around her palms, then out at the empty field where the rider had vanished. She didn't even know his name. The town of Salvation Creek looked like God had given up on it halfway through creation. It huddled in the valley like something ashamed of itself, a collection of weathered buildings and muddy streets that seemed to sink a little deeper into the earth every time it rained, which was often. The storm had been pounding the prairie for 3 days straight, turning the main street into a bog and the alleys into ankle-deep streams of brown water that carried away everything not nailed down. Most of the buildings leaned, some leaned into each other like drunks holding each other upright. The church steeple listed slightly to the left, and the general store's porch sagged in the middle where the wood had rotted through. Only the saloon stood straight, built by a carpenter who knew that men would crawl through hell for whiskey, so the building damn well better not fall on them while they drank. At the far end of the street, past the blacksmith's forge and the livery stable, sat a two-story structure that might have been called an inn if you were generous. If you weren't, you'd call it what it was. A dying woman's last dream, held together with hope and stubbornness and wood that should have been replaced a decade ago. The sign above the door read Mercy House in faded letters. Most folks just called it the widow's place. Inside, the woman from the carriage stood dripping onto the worn floorboards, her dress heavy with rain, her hair hanging in dark ropes down her back. Clara Ashford, 26 years old, daughter of the woman who'd built this inn with her bare hands and a prayer, inheritor of nothing but debt and a roof that leaked in 11 places. She stood in the empty front room, listening to the rain hammer against the windows, and wondered, not for the first time, if she was going to lose everything. The inn was quiet, too quiet. It had been weeks since the last paying guest. The stagecoach line had changed its route 6 months ago, and with it went the steady stream of travelers who used to fill these rooms. Now the only visitors were the wind and the rain, and the silence that settled into every corner like dust. Clara moved through the room slowly, peeling off her soaked shawl, her fingers numb and clumsy. She hung it by the cold fireplace, then stood there staring at the empty hearth. She should light a fire, should warm herself before she caught her death, should do 100 things, but all she could think about was the rider in the storm, the way he'd appeared out of nowhere, the way he'd held that terrified horse steady with just his hand and his will, the way he'd vanished without a word, like a ghost, like something the storm had conjured and then swallowed back up. She'd seen his silhouette, the broad line of his shoulders, the way he'd moved, like a man who'd been broken and put back together wrong, all the pieces still working but not quite the same. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and steady. Clara turned, her heart doing something strange in her chest. She crossed the room and opened the door. The man stood on her porch, rain streaming off the brim of his hat, his cloak dark and heavy with water. He was taller than she'd realized, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face, what she could see of it anyway. The hat cast most of his features in shadow, but she caught the line of his jaw, rough with several days' stubble, and the set of his mouth, not cruel but not soft either. A mouth that had forgotten how to smile. He didn't say anything, just stood there, water pooling at his boots. "You," Clara said. He inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement, not quite a greeting. "You saved my life." Another small nod. She waited for him to speak. When he didn't, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, please. You'll catch your death out there." He hesitated. It was brief, maybe a second, maybe less, but she saw it. The way he almost turned away. The way his hand moved toward the porch railing, like he was already preparing to leave. "Please," she said again, quieter this time. Something in her voice made him pause. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that she'd said please like she meant it, like she was asking for herself as much as for him. Whatever it was, he stepped inside. Water dripped from his cloak onto the floorboards. He stood just inside the doorway, not moving further, his eyes taking in the room with the careful assessment of a man who always knew where the exits were. Clara closed the door against the storm. The sound of rain became muffled, distant. The silence between them filled the space like something living. "You're hurt," she said. He glanced down at his left leg. She followed his gaze and saw it. The dark stain spreading through the fabric of his trousers, just above the knee. Blood, diluted by rainwater, running down to soak into his boot. "It's nothing," he said. The first words he'd spoken. His voice was low, rough, like something that hadn't been used in a while. It carried the faint accent of somewhere else. Somewhere east, maybe, or somewhere that used to matter before it stopped existing. "It's not nothing," Clara said. She moved toward him, but he stepped back, his hand coming up in a gesture that was part warning, part refusal. "I'll be fine. That cut needs tending. I've had worse." She believed him. Something about the way he said it, flat, factual, told her he'd had much worse and survived it all without anyone's help. But she didn't move away, just stood there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not pity, not curiosity, something closer to recognition. "At least let me get you some dry clothes," she said, "and something warm to drink. You can refuse that too, but it'd be a waste of good coffee." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough that it surprised them both. "Coffee," he said, Strong enough to wake the dead. Then I suppose I'd better stay. She turned and headed toward the back room, trusting him to follow. After a moment he did, limping slightly, leaving dark, wet footprints across the floor. The kitchen was small and warm, and smelled like cinnamon and old wood smoke. Clara moved through it with the easy familiarity of someone who'd spent half her life in this space, lighting the stove, setting the kettle on to boil, pulling out a tin of coffee grounds that looked like it had been refilled and reused 100 times. The stranger stood near the doorway. His cloak dripped onto the floor, his hat finally removed to reveal dark hair plastered to his skull and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone and then left out in the weather too long. He was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 35, maybe 40. Hard to tell with men like him. Men who'd lived enough for 2 lifetimes and wore it all in the lines around their eyes. "Sit," Clara said, gesturing to the table. He didn't sit, just leaned against the wall, taking the weight off his injured leg. She didn't push it. Just worked in silence, measuring coffee, waiting for the water to boil. The storm continued its assault on the building, rain drumming against the roof, wind rattling the windows. Inside, the kitchen felt like the only warm, dry place left in the world. "You live here alone?" he asked. Clara glanced at him. "Yes, that's dangerous. So is riding through a storm to save strangers." His mouth twitched again, almost a smile. "Fair point." The kettle began to whistle. She poured the water over the grounds, letting the rich, bitter smell fill the room. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed, just for a second, and she felt how cold his skin was. Cold enough to worry. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, poured herself a cup, and finally sat down at the table. He didn't join her, just stood there, drinking the coffee in slow, deliberate sips, his eyes distant. "What's your name?" Clara asked. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Does it matter? I'd like to know who to thank." Another pause. "Then James." She waited, but he didn't offer a last name. "Fair enough." Half the men who drifted through these parts carried their names like burdens they wanted to put down. "I'm Clara Ashford. This inn belonged to my mother. Now it's mine." She said it simply, without pride or shame, just fact. James nodded. "It's a good place." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "It's falling apart. Still standing, though. Barely." He took another sip of coffee, his eyes moving around the kitchen, taking in the worn counters, the patched walls, the careful repairs done with whatever materials were at hand. "You do all this work yourself? Most of it. Can't afford to hire help? That why you were driving the carriage yourself? In a storm?" Clara's jaw tightened. "I had to pick up supplies from Miller's Crossing. Couldn't wait for the weather to clear. I've got bills coming due and no way to pay them unless I can get the inn running again." James was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his cup. "The fence out back. It's broken." She blinked. "What?" "The fence. North side. 3 posts down, wire snapped in 2 places. Saw it when I rode in. Yes. It broke during the last storm. I haven't had time to fix it. Roof's got holes too. At least 4 I could see from the ground." Clara felt her cheeks flush. "I know what's wrong with my own building. Didn't say you didn't." He picked up his cup again, drained the last of the coffee. "Just saying it needs fixing. I'm aware. I could do it." She stared at him. "What?" "The fence, the roof, other things that need mending." He said it casually, like he was discussing the weather. "I'll work for room and board, no pay necessary." Clara shook her head slowly. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm offering." "Why?" The question hung between them. James looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes besides careful distance. Something that might have been loneliness, or guilt, or both. "Because you're right," he said quietly. "I saved your life today. Seems like I should make sure you keep it." He started work the next morning, before the sun rose, before Clara had even come downstairs. She woke to the sound of hammering, steady, rhythmic, purposeful. She dressed quickly and went outside to find James up on the roof, his shirt soaked through with rain and sweat, replacing shingles with the spare materials she'd been hoarding in the shed. He worked with the efficiency of a man who'd done this before, who'd built things and broken things and built them again. Clara stood in the yard watching him work and felt something shift in her chest. something that had been clenched tight for months, maybe years, beginning to loosen. "You didn't have to start so early," she called up. He glanced down at her, his face unreadable. "Storm's coming back this afternoon. Wanted to get the worst holes patched before then. There's breakfast inside when you're ready." He nodded and went back to work. She went inside, made eggs and bread, set a plate aside for him. When he finally came in an hour later, he ate in silence, standing at the counter, and then went back outside to work on the fence. That became the rhythm of their days. James worked. Clara ran the inn, such as it was. They spoke little, moved around each other like two people learning a careful dance. He fixed the fence, the roof, the broken step on the front porch. He repaired the door to the root cellar that hadn't closed properly in years. He oiled the hinges on every door in the building until they stopped squeaking. At night, he slept in the small room off the kitchen, the one Clara's mother used to use for storage. He never asked for anything more than a blanket and a pillow. Never complained, never explained. The town noticed, of course. Towns like Salvation Creek noticed everything. Within a week, Clara started hearing the whispers, the questions. Who was the stranger working at the widow's place? Where'd he come from? What was he running from? Because men like that, quiet men, nameless men, they were always running from something. Clara ignored the gossips. Let them talk. She had more important things to worry about, like the fact that for the first time in months the inn felt like it might survive another season. But late at night, when the wind howled through the valley and the old building creaked and settled, she'd lie awake in her room and wonder, who was James? What had he lost? And why did he look at the horizon every evening like he was searching for something he'd never find? 3 weeks after the storm, Clara found him standing in the yard at sunset, staring at the old windmill on the hill. She'd just finished cleaning the front room, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, her back aching. She'd stepped outside for air and seen him there, motionless, silhouetted against the dying light, his hands hanging loose at his sides. She walked over slowly, not wanting to startle him. "James?" He didn't turn, just kept staring at the windmill, its blades turning slowly in the evening breeze, creaking with each rotation. "I used to own land like this," he said quietly. Clara went still. He'd never spoken about his past, never offered anything beyond the bare minimum. This felt like a door opening, just a crack, but open nonetheless. "What happened?" she asked just as quietly. "I lost it." His voice was flat, factual. "Every acre, every building, every dream I'd ever had. How? Men who wanted it more than I could defend it. Men who knew how to make the law say whatever they needed it to say." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were hollow. "I was a fool. Thought honor mattered. Thought if you worked hard and built something real, no one could take it away." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry. Don't be. I learned." "Learned what?" "That the only thing that matters is what you can hold on to, and if you can't hold it—" He stopped, shook his head. "Doesn't matter." She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there was still goodness in the world, still justice. But the words stuck in her throat because she wasn't sure she believed them herself anymore. Instead, she said, "You deserve better than what they did to you." James looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Something raw and unguarded. "Maybe," he said, "but deserving and getting are two different things." He turned and walked back toward the inn, limping slightly, the last light of day burning gold around his shoulders. Clara stood there alone, watching him go, and realized with a sudden, startling clarity that she'd stopped thinking of him as a stranger. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without either of them planning it, he'd become something else. He'd become hers to worry about. And that terrified her more than the storm ever had. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and distant thunder. The prairie waited, patient and eternal, for whatever came next. The rain stopped on a Tuesday morning, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the sun break through the clouds for the first time in weeks. The light came down in shafts through the dissipating gray, touching the soaked earth like something tentative, something that wasn't sure it was welcome yet. The prairie steamed in the heat, vapor rising from the mud in ghostly wisps that drifted across the fields like the breath of something waking. Behind her, she heard the creak of floorboards. James moving through the front room, quiet as always, his footsteps careful and measured. She learned to recognize his movements by sound, the slight drag of his left foot when his leg was bothering him, The pause he always made at the bottom of the stairs, as if deciding each morning whether to stay or leave. He always stayed. She poured 2 cups of coffee without turning around, knowing he'd appear in the doorway in exactly 3 more steps. She counted them in her head. 1, 2, 3. Morning. His voice came from behind her. Morning. She handed him his cup, their ritual now so familiar it didn't need words. He took it with a slight nod, moved to the counter, leaned against it in the same spot he always chose. Close enough to be present, far enough to maintain distance. The sunlight crept into the kitchen, warming the worn floorboards. For the first time in weeks, the room didn't feel like they were hiding from something just outside the walls. "Fence is holding," James said after a long silence. "I saw. Should check the foundation on the south side, though. Ground's been so wet, might have shifted." Clara turned to look at him. He was studying his coffee like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked. His hair was longer now, curling slightly at his collar. He'd shaved 2 days ago, but the stubble was already coming back, dark against his jaw. The cut on his leg had healed clean. She'd insisted on tending it that first week, and he'd finally relented, sitting stiff and silent while she worked. She'd seen the other scars then, old ones, the kind that told stories he'd never speak aloud. "James," she said. He looked up. "You don't have to keep finding work. The roof's fixed. The fence is done. The foundation will hold." Something flickered across his face. Not quite fear, but close to it. "You want me to leave?" "No." The word came out faster than she'd intended. She took a breath, tried again. "I'm saying you've more than earned your keep. You could. Stay. Just stay, without needing a reason." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for something she couldn't name. "I need the work," he said finally. "Why?" "Because if I stop—" He cut himself off, looked away. "I just need it." Clara understood then. Understood that the work wasn't about payment or debt or earning his place. It was about keeping his hands busy and his mind occupied, about building something so he didn't have to think about everything he'd lost. She knew that feeling. She'd been living it herself for the past 2 years. "All right," she said softly. "The foundation, then." He nodded, drained his coffee and headed for the door. "James?" He paused, his hand on the frame. "Thank you." He didn't answer. Just gave her that small nod again and disappeared into the morning light. The town began to come alive as the water receded. Salvation Creek had been half drowned for so long that people had started to forget what dry streets looked like. Now, as the sun burned away the standing water and the mud began to harden into ruts, the town stretched and shook itself like an old dog waking from a long sleep. The general store opened its shutters. The blacksmith's forge roared back to life, sending up plumes of dark smoke and the ring of hammer on anvil. Even the church bells rang on Sunday, their sound carrying clear across the valley for the first time in weeks, and people noticed the changes at Mercy House. The straight fence, the new shingles, the fresh paint on the sign that Clara had finally gotten around to touching up. The flower boxes beneath the windows that someone, James, had built and filled with early wildflowers transplanted from the prairie. The inn looked like it was breathing again. Clara stood on the porch that afternoon, sweeping away the last of the dried mud, when she saw Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile walking up the road. The older woman moved with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission, her skirts gathered high to avoid the lingering puddles. "Clara Ashford," she called out when she was still 20 feet away. "I have been meaning to speak with you." Clara set the broom aside, braced herself. Mrs. Henderson was a good woman, kind mostly, but she had opinions about everything and believed it was her Christian duty to share them. "Mrs. Henderson, good to see you." The older woman climbed the steps, slightly winded, and looked around the porch with frank appraisal. "Place looks good, real good. Heard you got help." "Yes, ma'am. The man who's been staying here. The quiet one. His name is James." "James what?" Clara felt her spine straighten. "Just James." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "No family name?" "He hasn't offered one. And you didn't ask?" "I didn't feel it was my business." The older woman made a sound that could have been approval or disapproval. With Mrs. Henderson, it was hard to tell. She glanced toward the side of the building where James was working, then back at Clara. "People are talking," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "People always talk. They're saying he's running from something, that men like him, Drifters, no names, no past. They bring trouble. Clara felt heat rise in her chest. He's brought nothing but help. This place would have fallen apart without him. I'm not saying he's a bad man, child. I'm saying you should be careful. A young woman alone with a stranger. It doesn't look right. I'm not alone. I'm running an inn. He's a guest who's earning his keep. Mrs. Henderson studied her for a long moment, her eyes shrewd. You like him? It wasn't a question. Clara felt her cheeks flush. I respect him. He's a hard worker, and he's honest. Those are good qualities, but they don't tell you who a man really is. Maybe not. But watching how he treats broken things does. The older woman blinked, surprised by the sharpness in Clara's tone. Then her expression softened slightly. Your mother would have said the same thing. She always did see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Maybe that's not such a bad way to be. Mrs. Henderson sighed, reached out and squeezed Clara's hand. Just be careful, dear. The world's not always kind to women who trust too easily. She left before Clara could respond, making her way back down the road with the same purposeful stride. Clara stood there for a moment, her hands still warm from the older woman's touch, and wondered if Mrs. Henderson was right. If she was being foolish. If trusting James was going to break her the way everything else in her life had broken. But when she looked over and saw him kneeling in the mud, carefully shoring up the foundation with salvaged stones, his hands sure and steady, something in her chest said no. Some risks were worth taking. That night, Clara taught him how to balance the ledgers. It wasn't something she'd planned. But after dinner, a simple meal of beans and cornbread that they'd eaten in their usual comfortable silence, James had lingered at the table instead of retreating to his room. He'd watched her spread out the account books, the scattered receipts, the lists of debts and payments due. Problem? He'd asked. Always. She'd rubbed her eyes, exhausted. Numbers were never my strength. My mother handled all this. I'm just trying. He'd stood up, moved around the table, and looked over her shoulder at the chaos of papers. May I? She'd hesitated, then slid the ledger toward him. What followed was a quiet education. James didn't lecture or condescend. He simply showed her how to organize the columns, how to track expenses against income, how to project ahead so she could see problems coming before they arrived. His handwriting was neat, precise. The numbers lined up in perfect rows. You've done this before, Clara said, watching him work. Long time ago. What did you do? Before? She caught herself. Sorry, you don't have to answer that. He paused, his pen hovering over the page. For a moment she thought he'd ignore the question like he ignored most questions about his past. But then he said quietly, I ran a business. Land development. Bought property, built on it, sold it to families who wanted to settle. It was good work. Honest work. What happened? His jaw tightened. I trusted the wrong people. Had a partner, man named Garrett. He was connected, knew all the right officials, all the right judges. I thought that was an advantage. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turns out it was. Just not for me. Clara waited, not pushing. He falsified documents, James continued, his voice flat. Made it look like I'd been embezzling from our investors. By the time I figured out what he'd done, he'd already bought off everyone who mattered. The judge, the sheriff, even some of the investors themselves, paid them settlements to keep quiet and let him take over the company. That's, Clara's hands clenched into fists. That's not legal, that's theft. Legal's just a word for whatever the people in power say it is. You fought it, though. Surely you. I tried. He set down the pen, stared at the ledger without seeing it. Spent everything I had on lawyers, lost anyway. They seized my assets, froze my accounts, said I owed restitution for the money I'd supposedly stolen. His voice went even quieter. I didn't steal anything. I built that company from nothing. Every contract, every acre, every building. I earned it. I believe you. He looked at her then, surprise clear in his eyes. Why? Because you're here, fixing my fence, teaching me bookkeeping. You could have kept riding that night in the storm, could have left a dozen times since. But you stayed and you worked and you didn't ask for anything in return. She held his gaze. That's not what a thief does. Something shifted in James's expression, something that looked like it hurt and healed at the same time. Maybe, he said, or maybe I'm just trying to earn back something I can never get back. What's that? The belief that I'm worth something. Clara's throat tightened. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm, calloused, strong. "You are," she said, "worth something, worth a lot." He stared at their hands for a long moment, then slowly pulled away. Not unkindly, just careful. Like he was afraid of what might happen if he held on. "Let's finish these numbers," he said, his voice rough. They worked until the candles burned low, until the columns balanced and the projections were clear. When they finally closed the ledger, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in months. Control. Not over everything. Not over the debts or the future or the 100 things that could still go wrong. But over this moment, this small victory, this proof that she wasn't alone in fighting for her mother's dream. "Thank you," she said. James stood, stretched, his shadow long on the wall. "You're a quick learner. I had a good teacher." He almost smiled. "Almost. Get some rest. Morning comes early." He disappeared into his room, closing the door softly behind him. Clara sat alone at the table, staring at the neat rows of numbers, and realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was starting to need him. Not just his labor or his knowledge, but him. His presence. The way he moved through the space like an anchor, steady and solid. The way he listened more than he spoke. The way he seemed to understand loss without needing it explained. And she had no idea what to do with that feeling. Summer arrived slowly, creeping across the prairie like something tentative, something testing the ground before committing. The days grew longer and warmer. The mud dried and cracked. The wild grass turned from green to gold, rippling in waves whenever the wind blew. The sky stretched out endlessly blue, broken only by the occasional cloud trailing shadows across the land. And Mercy House began to fill again. Not with many guests, not yet, but enough to matter. A traveling salesman who needed a bed for the night. A family passing through on their way to homestead land further west. A group of ranch hands looking for a hot meal and a clean room. Clara moved through her days with renewed energy, cooking and cleaning and greeting guests with a smile that felt genuine for the first time in years. And beside her, always, was James. He'd become part of the fabric of the place. The guest never questioned his presence. He was just there, fixing a broken chair, carrying water, chopping wood for the stove. He spoke little, but he was never unkind. The children especially seemed drawn to him. They'd watch him work with wide eyes, asking questions he'd answer with patience and the occasional, dry humor that surprised them into laughter. One afternoon, Clara found him teaching a young boy, maybe 8 years old, son of the homesteading family, how to properly hammer a nail. "It's all in the wrist," James was saying, demonstrating with slow, deliberate movements. "You don't force it, you guide it. Let the hammer do the work." The boy tried, his small face scrunched in concentration. The nail went in crooked. James didn't criticize, just pulled it out, set up a new one, and handed the hammer back. Again. It took 6 tries before the boy got it right. When he did, when that nail finally went straight and true, James nodded. "Good. Now you know." The boy beamed like he'd just won a prize. Clara watched from the porch, something warm and aching spreading through her chest. This was the man the town whispered about. The drifter. The one with no name and no past. They didn't know him at all. On the first Sunday in June, Clara convinced James to walk with her to the hill overlooking town. It wasn't easy. He resisted anything that took him away from work, from the constant motion that kept his mind occupied. But she'd been persistent, arguing that even good workers needed rest, and eventually he'd relented. They walked in silence, the tall grass brushing against their legs, the sun warm on their shoulders. At the top of the hill, they stopped. The valley spread out before them, the town small and quiet, the inn just visible at the far end of the street, smoke rising from someone's chimney. "It's beautiful," Clara said. James was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "It is. Do you think you'll stay?" The question hung between them, delicate and dangerous. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've never been good at staying. Maybe you just haven't found the right reason." He looked at her then, something unguarded in his expression. "Maybe." They stood there as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wild sage and summer heat. Clara wanted to say more, wanted to tell him that she hoped he'd stay, that the inn felt different with him in it, that she felt different. But the words wouldn't come. They stuck in her throat, too heavy and too true. So instead she just stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching, and watched the light fade over the prairie. And when they finally walked back down the hill, she noticed something she hadn't before. James wasn't limping anymore. Whatever wound he'd carried, in his leg or somewhere deeper, was starting to heal. That night, Clara lay awake in her room, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around her. She could hear James moving in the room below, his footsteps, the creak of his bed as he lay down, the silence that followed. She wondered if he was sleeping or if he was staring at the ceiling the way she was, thinking about everything and nothing, feeling the weight of the day and the promise of tomorrow. The inn had been her mother's dream, a place of mercy, the name said, a place where weary travelers could find rest and kindness and a warm meal. But somewhere along the way, it had become Clara's dream too, and now, unexpectedly, impossibly, it was becoming something more. A home. Not just for her, for him too, if he'd let it be. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying secrets and promises that neither of them could yet hear clearly. But they were there, waiting, like seeds planted in good soil, just beginning to take root. The next morning, Clara found something on the porch. James's hat, the one he'd worn that night in the storm. It sat there in the early light, brim up, and inside it was a single wildflower, prairie rose, pink and delicate. No note, no explanation. Just the flower. Clara picked it up carefully, held it to her nose, breathed in its faint, sweet scent. And she smiled, a real smile. One that started in her chest and bloomed across her face like light breaking through clouds. She looked toward the barn where James was already working, his figure dark against the rising sun. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her, just kept working. But she knew, he'd left it for her. This quiet man who spoke more through actions than words, who built things instead of making promises, who was healing in the same way she was, slowly, carefully, one day at a time. Clara placed the flower in a small vase on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light would touch it. And as she began her day, making coffee, preparing breakfast, opening the windows to let in the summer air, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Hope. Not the desperate kind, not the kind born from need or fear, but the quiet kind, the kind that grows when you're not looking, the kind that says maybe, just maybe, broken things can be made whole again. If you're patient, if you're kind, if you're willing to believe that what you've lost doesn't define what you can still become. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly golden beneath an endless blue sky, and in the distance, too far to see but close enough to feel, the future waited, patient and full of possibility, like rain clouds gathering on a summer horizon. The windmill turned in the evening light, its blades cutting slow circles against the sky. James stood at the fence line, watching it. He did this most evenings now. Stood there with his hands resting on the top rail, his eyes tracking the movement of those weathered blades as they caught the wind and converted it into something useful, something that drew water from the earth and gave life to everything around it. Clara had stopped asking what he was thinking during these moments. She'd learned that some silences were meant to be respected, not filled. But tonight, she walked out to join him anyway. The grass had turned fully gold now, rippling in waves that stretched to the horizon. The heat of the day was finally breaking, releasing its grip on the prairie as the sun descended. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song, clear and bright and achingly beautiful. She stood beside him at the fence, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Long day?" she asked. "They're all long." He said it without complaint. "Just fact. The Henderson's boy said you helped him fix his wagon wheel this morning. Bearing was shot. Just needed replacing. Mrs. Henderson brought over a pie to say thank you." The corner of his mouth lifted. Almost a smile. "She's still worried I'm going to corrupt you?" Clara laughed softly. "Probably. But the pie suggests she's willing to overlook it for now." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the windmill turn. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents, its shadow skating across the golden grass below. "You ever think about leaving?" Clara asked suddenly. James glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Every day." Her chest tightened. "Why don't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Haven't found a good enough reason to go." "Is that the same as having a good enough reason to stay?" "Don't know. Still figuring it out." Clara felt something shift between them, something delicate and important. She wanted to push, to ask what would make him stay, to tell him all the reasons she hoped he would. But she'd learned patience from watching him work. Learned that some things couldn't be rushed, that building something solid took time and care and the willingness to let each piece settle before adding the next. So instead, she just said, "Well, I hope you figure it out." "Me too," he said quietly. The sun touched the horizon, setting the sky ablaze with orange and crimson and gold. The windmill's blades turned steadily, catching the last of the light, and for a moment everything felt suspended, balanced on the edge between day and night, between what was and what might be. Then James pushed off from the fence. "Should check the horses before dark." "I'll help." He nodded, and they walked back toward the barn together, their shadows stretching long across the ground behind them. Summer settled into Salvation Creek like a warm blanket, heavy and enveloping. The days took on a rhythm that felt almost dreamlike in its simplicity. Clara woke early, before the sun, and started coffee while James tended the animals. They'd eat breakfast together, usually in silence, but a silence that felt companionable now, not empty. Then the work would begin. There was always work. The inn had come back to life in ways Clara hadn't dared hope for. Word had spread somehow, through travelers, through Mrs. Henderson's careful gossip, through whatever mysterious channels small towns used to communicate, that Mercy House was open again and worth stopping at, that the rooms were clean, the food was good, and the prices were fair. But more than that, people came because of the feeling the place had. Clara could see it in their faces when they arrived, the way they relaxed when they stepped through the door, the way their shoulders dropped and their expressions softened. The inn felt safe, welcoming, like something their grandparents might have built, back when the world was simpler and people still believed in kindness. James was part of that feeling, though he'd never admit it. He moved through the space like a ghost, always working, always present but never intrusive. He'd carry luggage without being asked. He'd fix a squeaky door hinge while a guest was at dinner. He'd stable someone's horse and make sure it was fed and watered before the owner even thought to ask. Children especially gravitated toward him. There was a boy, Tommy Sullivan, son of a rancher from 2 valleys over, who'd taken to following James around like a devoted shadow. The boy was maybe 10, all elbows and knees and earnest questions, and James tolerated his presence with the patience of a saint. One afternoon, Clara watched from the kitchen window as James taught Tommy how to split wood properly. "It's not about strength," James was saying, demonstrating with the axe. "It's about aim. You want to hit the grain, where it's already weak. See this crack here?" He pointed at the log. "That's where you focus." Tommy nodded seriously, his small face determined. James handed him a smaller axe, one he must have made specifically for the boy's size. The first swing went wide, the second bounced off the log, the third split it clean through. Tommy's whoop of joy carried clear across the yard. James didn't smile, but Clara saw the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his hand came down briefly on the boy's shoulder. Just for a second, but enough. She turned away from the window, something warm and aching blooming in her chest. This man. This quiet, wounded man who'd shown up on her doorstep in the middle of a storm. He was good. Not just capable or reliable or useful. Good. The kind of good that showed in actions, not words. The kind that built things and mended things and taught children how to split wood without ever asking for thanks or recognition. And she was falling for him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She grabbed the edge of the counter, her breath catching, her heart doing something complicated and terrifying in her chest. She was falling for him. Maybe had been falling for him since that first night, when he'd appeared out of the storm like something conjured from her own desperation. Or maybe it had happened more slowly, accumulating across all these small, quiet moments. Coffee in the morning, ledgers at night, watching him work, listening to his rare smiles, learning the shape of his silences. It didn't matter when it had started, it only mattered that it was true, and she had no idea what to do about it. The next Sunday, the church bells rang clear across the valley. Clara dressed carefully, her good dress, the blue one with the white collar that her mother had made, and walked into town for services. She hadn't been in weeks. Between running the inn and working alongside James, she'd let her attendance slip. But Mrs. Henderson had stopped by yesterday, with a pointed look and a gentle reminder that the Lord appreciated consistency, and Clara had felt the guilt of it, so she went. The church was small and white and sat on a slight rise at the north end of town. Inside, it smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the perfume Mrs. Henderson wore that was slightly too strong and slightly too floral. Clara slid into a pew near the back, nodding at familiar faces, accepting the kind smiles and curious glances. Reverend Peters was a good man, earnest and well-meaning if a bit long-winded. His sermon that morning was about mercy and judgment, about how the Lord called them to love their neighbors even when those neighbors didn't fit the mold they expected. Clara wondered if he was talking about James. Probably. Small towns didn't have secrets, just temporarily unspoken truths. After the service, she stood on the church steps, squinting in the bright sunlight, and Mrs. Henderson appeared at her elbow like a well-dressed ghost. "Clara, dear, you look lovely." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Haven't seen your guest at services." There it was. Clara kept her expression neutral. "James isn't much for crowds, or for God. I don't know what James is for. But I know he's a good man." Mrs. Henderson studied her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "You care for him. It wasn't a question." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "I appreciate his help." "That's not what I said." "I know what you said." The older woman sighed, reached out, and patted Clara's hand. "Just be careful, dear. The heart has a terrible habit of wanting what it can't have." "And what makes you think I can't have him?" "Because men like that, men running from their pasts, they don't stay. They can't. Eventually, whatever they're running from catches up, and when it does, they run again. It's in their nature." Clara felt something sharp and defensive rise in her chest. "You don't know him." "No, but I know the type. I was young once too, believe it or not. And I learned that love isn't enough to hold someone who's already halfway gone." She squeezed Clara's hand once more, then disappeared into the dispersing crowd. Clara stood there on the church steps, her mother's dress suddenly too tight, the sun too bright, Mrs. Henderson's words echoing in her head like a prophecy she desperately wanted to disprove. When she got back to the inn, she found James in the root cellar, organizing supplies. He looked up when her shadow fell across the doorway, his hair falling into his eyes, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "How was church?" he asked. "Fine." Something in her tone made him pause. He straightened, studying her face. "What happened?" "Nothing. Just town gossip. About me. About us." He went very still. "What are they saying?" Clara descended the steps into the cellar, suddenly needing to be on the same level as him. "That you're going to leave. That men like you always do." James looked away, his jaw tight. "They're probably right." The words hit her like a slap. "Is that what you think?" "I don't know what I think. You've been here 3 months, James. 3 months of waking up here, working here, eating here, sleeping here. At what point does that stop being temporary?" "I don't—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "I can't promise anything, Clara. I don't have anything to promise with." "I'm not asking for promises." "Then what are you asking for?" "Honesty." She moved closer, close enough to see the conflict in his eyes. "Tell me the truth. Do you want to leave?" He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something raw and honest break through his careful defenses. "No," he said quietly. "I don't want to leave." "Then don't." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because—" He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. "Because I don't deserve this. Any of this. This place, this work, this peace. I lost everything I had because I was stupid and trusting and weak. I don't get to just find it again. That's not how the world works." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You're not weak, James. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. I'm a coward. I ran instead of fighting. I let them take everything and I just disappeared. You survived. That's not cowardice, that's wisdom." He shook his head, his expression bleak. "You don't understand. Then help me understand." "I can't." His voice cracked. "Because if I let myself believe this is real, that I could stay here, that I could have this life, and then I lose it again." He trailed off. Couldn't finish. Clara understood then. Understood that it wasn't about whether he wanted to stay, it was about whether he could bear to hope for something after having hope destroyed so completely. She reached out slowly and took his hand. His fingers were rough and warm, and they closed around hers with a grip that felt desperate. "You deserve better than running from ghosts," she said softly, echoing her own words from months ago. "You deserve a life, a real one, and if you want it here." She took a breath. "I want you here." James looked at their joined hands. then up at her face, and something in his expression shifted. Something that looked like surrender and relief and terror all at once. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "Do what?" "Stay. Hope. Believe in something again. Then we'll figure it out together." He pulled her closer, not into an embrace, but into something simpler and more profound. Just proximity. Just the comfort of another human being who understood what it felt like to be broken and still fighting to be whole. They stood there in the cool dimness of the root cellar, holding on to each other like anchors, while above them the summer sun beat down on the prairie, and the world continued its endless turning. The days that followed were different, not dramatically, not obviously, but there was a shift, subtle as morning light, but just as undeniable. James still worked from dawn until dusk, still fixed things and built things and improved things, but now he'd pause sometimes, look up when Clara passed, offer a small smile that was just for her. They began eating dinner together at the table instead of in shifts, started talking more, not about the past, not yet, but about small things, the weather, the guests, plans for expanding the vegetable garden, the way the sunset looked from the hill. One evening James brought in wildflowers, a whole armful of them, prairie rose and wild indigo and black-eyed Susans, and set them on the kitchen table without a word. Clara stared at them, at the riot of color against the worn wood, and felt her throat tighten. "They were growing near the fence line," James said, suddenly awkward. "Thought they might brighten the place up. They're beautiful. They're just flowers." "No." She met his eyes. "They're not." He held her gaze for a moment, understanding passing between them, then turned back to whatever task he'd invented to keep his hands busy. But the flowers stayed. And every few days, when the old ones began to wilt, new ones would appear. In July, a family arrived. The Prescotts, traveling west with everything they owned, packed into a covered wagon. They were young, the parents maybe Clara's age, with 3 children under 8 years old, exhausted, hopeful, scared beneath their forced optimism. Clara gave them the best rooms, charged them half price, made sure the children had extra helpings at dinner. James repaired a broken wheel on their wagon without being asked, and when Mr. Prescott tried to pay him, he refused. "Just passing on what was given to me," he said simply. Their last night, Mrs. Prescott came downstairs after tucking in her children and found Clara and James sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge. "I wanted to thank you both," she said, "not just for the room and the food, but for—" She paused, searching for words. "For reminding us why we're doing this, why we're going west. We've been on the road so long we'd started to forget that there are still good people in the world, people who help just because it's right." Clara felt her throat tighten. "We're glad we could help." Mrs. Prescott smiled, touched Clara's shoulder, then went back inside. James was quiet for a long time after she left. "I used to be like them," he said finally. "Used to believe that if you worked hard and treated people right, everything would work out. You don't believe that anymore." "I don't know what I believe." Clara reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. He tensed for a moment, then relaxed, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it made her chest ache. "Maybe that's okay," she said. "Maybe you don't have to believe in everything, just in something, like what? Like this." She gestured at the inn, at the night, at the two of them sitting together in the dark, like the fact that broken things can be mended, that tomorrow might be better than today, that you're not alone anymore. James looked at her, and in the starlight she saw his eyes glisten. "I'm afraid," he whispered. "Of what?" "Of hoping again, of letting myself believe this is real, of waking up one day and finding out it was all just temporary." Clara squeezed his hand. "Everything's temporary, James. That's what makes it precious." He nodded slowly, understanding, and they sat there together as the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang to the moon. Inside the inn, the Prescott children dreamed of their new life. In the barn, the horses slept standing. In the fields, the wheat grew quietly, preparing for harvest. And on the porch of Mercy House, 2 wounded people held onto each other and dared, just for a moment, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they deserved the peace they'd found. August arrived with heat that shimmered off the prairie like something alive. The work continued. The guests came and went. The inn thrived in ways Clara had thought impossible just months ago. And James stayed, not because he had to, not because he owed anything, but because he chose to. Every morning was a choice, every task he completed, Every evening he stood at the fence watching the windmill turn. Every night he went to his small room and closed the door and didn't pack his few belongings and slip away in the dark. He stayed. And slowly, carefully, the weight he carried began to lighten. Clara could see it in the way he moved, less careful now, less like a man expecting the floor to collapse beneath him. She could hear it in his voice when he spoke to the guests, to the children, to her. There was something in him that was beginning to uncurl, like a fern in spring, reaching tentatively toward the light. One evening, she found him teaching Tommy Sullivan how to carve wood. They sat on the porch steps, James's knife moving in careful, controlled strokes, shaving curls of pine onto the ground. Tommy watched with the intense focus only children possess, his tongue caught between his teeth. "It's all about patience," James was saying. "You can't rush it. The wood tells you what it wants to be. You just have to listen. What if I mess up? Then you start over. Wood's forgiving that way." "Are people forgiving?" James paused, glanced up at Clara standing in the doorway. Something passed between them, understanding, memory, hope. "Some are," he said. "The best ones are." Tommy nodded seriously, accepting this as fact, and James handed him the knife. Clara watched them work together until the light began to fade, and she felt something settle in her chest. Something that felt like certainty. This was her life now, not the one she'd imagined, not the one her mother had dreamed for her, but something better, something richer, built from loss and pain and the slow, steady work of healing. And James was part of it, not as a guest, not as hired help, but as something that didn't have a name yet, something that was still taking shape between them, built one careful day at a time. That night, after Tommy's family had left and the inn was quiet, James found Clara in the kitchen washing dishes. He picked up a towel without a word and began drying. They worked in silence, the familiar rhythm of their movements synchronized now, practiced. When the last dish was dried and put away, when the kitchen was clean and the lamps turned low, James didn't leave. He just stood there, the towel still in his hands, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Clara," he said. "Yes, I'm staying." The words were simple, final, true. "I know," she said softly, "not just for now. Not just until something better comes along. He paused, searching for words. "I'm staying, if you'll have me." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I'll have you." He nodded, relief washing over his face, and for the first time since she'd met him, James smiled. A real smile. One that reached his eyes and softened all the hard edges and made him look younger, lighter, whole. She moved toward him and he met her halfway, and when his arms came around her it felt like coming home. Not the dramatic homecoming of stories. Just the quiet, profound relief of finding a place where you fit, where you're wanted, where the broken pieces of who you are don't need to be hidden or explained. They stood there in the warm kitchen, holding each other as the summer night pressed close around the old building, and outside the windmill turned steadily in the darkness, drawing water from the deep earth, giving life to everything that grew beneath the endless prairie sky. The dust came first. Clara saw it from the kitchen window. A brown cloud rising on the eastern road, moving fast, too fast for a casual traveler. She set down the pan she'd been scrubbing and dried her hands on her apron, something uneasy stirring in her chest. Riders coming hard meant news, and news that arrived at speed was rarely good. James was in the barn, replacing a hinge on the tackroom door. She could hear the steady rhythm of his hammer, the sound carrying clear across the yard in the still morning air. The day was already hot, the kind of heat that pressed down from above and radiated up from below, turning the world into something shimmering and uncertain. The dust cloud grew closer. She could make out shapes now. 3 horses, 3 riders, moving with the purposeful trajectory of men on official business. The hammering stopped. Clara turned and saw James standing in the barn doorway, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand had moved instinctively to rest on the doorframe. Not quite blocking the exit, but close. The riders slowed as they reached the inn, their horses blowing hard, foam on their bits. The man in front was older, maybe 50, with a thick gray mustache and a star pinned to his vest that caught the sunlight. His eyes were hard, the kind of hard that came from seeing too much and caring too little. Sheriff's eyes. The other 2 men were younger, deputies by the look of them, lean and watchful in the way of men paid to notice things. Clara stepped out onto the porch, arranging her face into something pleasant and professional. "Gentlemen, can I help you?" The sheriff dismounted, with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. He didn't remove his hat, didn't smile. Just stood there looking at the inn, at the fresh paint and the mended fence and the flower boxes, like he was cataloging evidence. This the Ashford place? His voice was rough, like gravel shifting. Mercy House, yes. I'm Clara Ashford, Sheriff Pike, out of Cutter's Ridge. He gestured to the deputies. These are my men. We're tracking someone, criminal fugitive. Heard you might be harboring him. The words hit her like cold water. I'm sorry? Don't be coy, Miss Ashford. We got word there's a man been working here. Tall, dark hair, keeps to himself. That sound familiar? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her voice steady. I have a hired hand, yes. But he's no criminal. That so? Pike's smile didn't reach his eyes. What's his name? James? James? What? Clara hesitated, and Pike's smile widened. Don't know his full name, do you? Been living here for months, and you don't even know his proper Christian name. That strike you as odd? Plenty of men in these parts don't use full names. That's true. But most of them aren't wanted for fraud and embezzlement. The world tilted slightly. Clara gripped the porch railing. That's not, you're mistaken. James hasn't done anything wrong. You know that for certain, do you? Pike moved closer to the porch, his boots heavy on the steps. Or are you just hoping real hard that it's true? Before Clara could answer, James emerged from the barn. He moved slowly, deliberately, his hands visible at his sides, the walk of a man who'd dealt with law enforcement before and knew how quickly things could go wrong. His face was carefully blank, but Clara saw the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes tracked each deputy's position. Pike turned, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, satisfaction, the look of a hunter who'd just spotted his quarry. Well, I'll be damned, Pike said softly. James Holloway. Been a long time. James stopped 10 feet away. Sheriff Pike, you two know each other? Clara's voice came out higher than she intended. Oh, we know each other. Pike crossed his arms, his stance easy and confident. Mr. Holloway here used to be quite the prominent citizen. Land developer. Built half the county before he decided to start stealing from his investors. That's not what happened. James's voice was flat, controlled. No, that what the jury said. That what the judge ruled. You got a different version? I got the truth. Pike laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. The truth. That's rich. Tell me, Holloway, what's the truth about the $70,000 that went missing from your company accounts? What's the truth about the families you swindled out of their savings? I didn't steal anything. Garrett falsified those records. Garrett. Pike spat the name. You're still blaming Robert Garrett? Man's a respected businessman now. Turned your failing company around, paid back all them investors you cheated. He's a goddamn hero while you're out here hiding in the weeds. Clara felt sick. She looked at James, willing him to deny it, to explain, to make this make sense. But James just stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his face carved from stone. James? Her voice cracked on his name. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. It's complicated. Complicated. Pike laughed again. That's one word for it. Here's what's not complicated. You're wanted in 3 counties for fraud. Got a warrant here, says I can bring you in. On what charges? Clara's voice came out stronger than she felt. If he was convicted, wouldn't he be in prison already? Pike's eyes narrowed. Trial got postponed. Holloway here disappeared before the verdict came down. Made him a fugitive. And now, he smiled. Now we found him. James took a step back. I'm not going back. That's not up to you. I didn't do what they're accusing me of. Garrett set me up, bought off the judge, fabricated evidence, so you say. But that's for a court to decide. You running just makes you look guilty. I'm not running anymore. Really? Pike gestured at the inn, at Clara, at everything James had built here. This look like facing your problems? This looks like hiding. Like taking advantage of a kind woman's hospitality while lying about who you are. He didn't lie, Clara said, even as doubt crept into her chest like cold water. He's worked hard, been honest. Pike turned his attention to her, his expression almost pitying. Miss Ashford, do you have any idea who this man really is? What he's capable of? I know he saved my life. Maybe so. But that don't erase what he did to others. that don't give back the money he stole or the families he ruined. Pike moved toward James, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. Time to go, Holloway. You can come quiet or we can make this harder than it needs to be. James looked at Clara then, finally, and in his eyes she saw something that broke her heart. Not guilt, not shame, resignation. Like he'd always known this moment would come. Like some part of him had been waiting for it. James, don't. She didn't know what she was asking. Don't go. Don't give up. Don't let this be true. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have told you. Should have. He stopped, shook his head. I'm sorry. For what? Her voice was shaking now. For lying? For using me? For letting me think? She couldn't finish. Couldn't give voice to the hope she'd been carrying, the future she'd let herself imagine. I never lied to you. You never told me the truth either. He flinched like she'd struck him. No, I didn't. Pike made an impatient sound. This is real touching, but we got a schedule to keep. Let's go, Holloway. Wait. Clara stepped off the porch, moved between Pike and James. If he's innocent, if this Garrett really did frame him, then taking him back is just letting a guilty man go free. That's for the courts to figure out. The same courts Garrett owns? The same judge he paid off? She turned to James. Tell them. Explain what happened. But James just shook his head. I tried that already. Nobody believed me then. They won't believe me now. I believe you. The words hung in the hot air between them, simple and absolute. James stared at her, something raw and wounded in his expression. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do. I know you, James. I've watched you work, watched you help people, watched you be kind when you didn't have to be. That's not who criminals are. That's not who guilty men are. Sometimes it is. His voice was barely a whisper. Sometimes guilty men do good things hoping it'll balance the scales, hoping it'll make them worth something again. You were always worth something. Pike made a disgusted sound. This is real sweet, but it don't change the law. Now step aside, Miss Ashford, before I charge you with obstruction. Clara didn't move. You're making a mistake. The only mistake being made here is yours, ma'am, trusting a con man. Pike gestured to his deputies. Get him! The deputies moved forward. James tensed but didn't run, didn't resist as they pulled his arms behind his back and secured them with rope. He kept his eyes on Clara the whole time, and she saw in them everything they'd built together crumbling like sand. James, take care of the inn, he said. The roof still needs work on the south corner, and the pump in the well, it sticks sometimes. You have to, his voice caught. You'll be fine without me. I don't want to be fine without you, Pike snorted. Give it a month. You'll realize you're better off. He swung back into his saddle, nodded to his deputies. They hauled James toward one of the horses, forced him up into the saddle despite his bound hands. The whole thing happened so fast. One moment James was there, standing in her yard, part of her life. The next he was mounted and surrounded by armed men, looking at her like he was memorizing her face for the long dark ahead. Wait! Clara ran forward, grabbed the bridle of James's horse. Where are you taking him? Cutter's Ridge. Trial's in 2 weeks. Can I visit him? Pike shrugged. That's between you and the jail, but if you're smart, you'll forget about him. Men like Holloway, they only bring trouble to those fool enough to care about them. He spurred his horse forward, and the others followed. James looked back once, just once, his eyes finding hers across the growing distance. She wanted to say something. Wanted to call out that she'd fight for him, that she'd prove his innocence, that this wasn't over. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with doubt and fear, and the terrible question Pike had planted in her mind. What if James really was guilty? What if everything she thought she knew about him was just a careful lie? The riders disappeared into their own dust cloud, moving back toward the eastern road. Within minutes they were gone, swallowed by the prairie as completely as James had appeared from the storm all those months ago. Clara stood in the yard, her hand still extended like she was reaching for something that had already slipped away, and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The inn felt wrong without him. Clara moved through it like a ghost, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind spun in endless circles, cooking breakfast for guests who chattered obliviously about the weather, making beds, sweeping floors, each action mechanical, empty. She kept expecting to hear him, the sound of his hammer, his footsteps on the porch, his voice low and steady as he greeted the horses in the barn. But there was only silence. Mrs. Henderson arrived that afternoon, her face arranged in an expression of concerned sympathy that Clara wanted to scrape off with a knife. "I heard," the older woman said, settling into a kitchen chair without invitation. "The whole town's heard by now. That sheriff made quite the scene when he stopped at the Mercantile." Clara poured coffee with shaking hands. "What's he saying?" "That James Holloway, that's his full name, did you know, is a wanted criminal, that he swindled investors out of thousands of dollars, that he fled prosecution and has been hiding here, letting you shelter him while he—" "Stop." Clara set down the coffee pot harder than necessary. "Just stop." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "I'm not saying this to hurt you, child, but you need to hear it. People are talking, saying you were foolish to trust a stranger, saying maybe you were complicit. Complicit." Clara's voice rose. "I didn't even know there were charges against him. I believe you, but others." She trailed off meaningfully. "You need to be careful. Your reputation—" "I don't care about my reputation. You should. A woman alone, running a business, you can't afford scandal." Clara laughed, the sound bitter. "It's too late for that." They sat in silence, the coffee cooling between them. Finally, Mrs. Henderson reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand. "Do you believe him?" she asked quietly. "That he's innocent?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I know him. You know what he showed you. That's not the same thing." Clara pulled her hand back. "He's not a criminal. He's a good man who got cheated by people with more power. Maybe. Or maybe that's what he wanted you to believe." Mrs. Henderson stood, gathering her shawl. "I hope you're right, dear. I truly do. But hope doesn't change facts. And the fact is, that man brought trouble to your door." She left before Clara could respond. Clara sat alone in the kitchen, staring at James's empty coffee cup, and felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest like a stone. What did she really know about him? He'd appeared in a storm, worked hard, been kind, kept his past buried under careful silence. But what if that silence hid guilt instead of injustice? What if Pike was right? She pushed the thought away violently, stood up, began cleaning with furious energy. She wouldn't believe it, couldn't. Because if James was guilty, if everything between them had been built on lies, then her judgment was worthless and her trust was foolish, and she was exactly what everyone thought, a lonely woman desperate enough to believe anything. No, she knew him, knew the way he moved through the world with quiet integrity, knew the gentleness in his hands when he worked, knew the pain in his eyes when he spoke about his past. That wasn't guilt, that was grief, and she would prove it. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around her. Without James's presence below, the building felt hollow, echoey, like something vital had been extracted, leaving only empty rooms and memories. She thought about the first night he'd appeared, the storm, the way he'd saved her without asking for anything in return, the months that followed, each day a small gift, each gesture building towards something she'd started to believe was real. Had it been real? Or had she been so starved for connection, so desperate to save her mother's dream, that she'd invented meaning where there was none? She rolled over, pressed her face into the pillow, and felt tears finally come. Not gentle tears, hard, angry, frightened tears that shook her whole body and left her gasping. She cried for the loss of him, for the uncertainty, for the future she'd let herself imagine that now felt impossibly distant. But mostly she cried because she was furious. At Pike for taking him, at James for not fighting back, at herself for caring this much about a man who might be exactly what everyone said he was. When the tears finally stopped, she lay exhausted in the dark, her eyes gritty and swollen, her chest aching, and made a decision. If James was innocent, if he really had been framed, then someone needed to fight for him. Someone needed to dig up the truth and drag it into the light where everyone could see it. Pike wouldn't do it. The law had already made up its mind, which meant it was up to her. Clara sat up, lit a candle, pulled out paper and pen. She began making a list. Names, questions, places to investigate. Robert Garrett, the trial, the missing money, the investors who'd supposedly been cheated. Somewhere in that mess was the truth, and she would find it, even if it destroyed her, even if it proved she'd been wrong about everything. Because James, the James she knew, the one who'd taught children and mended fences and brought her wildflowers, he deserved someone to believe in him. And if that someone had to be her, then so be it. She found him on the courthouse steps 3 days later. Not James, Pike's brother. Clara had ridden to Cutter's Ridge at dawn, the journey taking most of the day across dry prairie that shimmered with heat. The town was bigger than Salvation Creek, a proper county seat with brick buildings and paved streets and the smell of civilization that always seemed to involve horse manure and desperation in equal measure. The courthouse dominated the square, a 2-story structure of pale stone that looked like it was trying very hard to seem important, and on its steps, signing papers with a gold pen that caught the afternoon sun, was a man who could only be related to Sheriff Pike. Same gray mustache, though more carefully groomed. Same hard eyes, though better at hiding it behind a politician's smile. He wore an expensive suit and a watch chain that probably cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. She walked up to him slowly, her heart hammering. "Mr. Garrett?" He looked up, his smile automatic and professional. "That's correct. How may I help you, miss? I'm Clara Ashford. From Salvation Creek. I need to speak with you about James Holloway." The smile didn't falter, but something shifted behind his eyes. Calculation. "Ah, the innkeeper. I heard you'd been harboring Mr. Holloway. I gave him honest work. I didn't know he was wanted." "Of course not. Why don't we speak somewhere more private?" He gestured toward a nearby office building, his manner solicitous and concerned, the face of a man who made his living convincing people to trust him. Clara followed, her instincts screaming warnings she tried to ignore. The office was elegant, dark, wood, leather chairs, a massive desk covered in neat stacks of contracts and ledgers. Garrett offered her a seat, poured her water from a crystal carafe, settled into his own chair like a king on a throne. "Now then," he said, "what can I do for you, Miss Ashford? James says you framed him, that you falsified records and stole from the company." Garrett's expression shifted to something like pity. "Did he? And you believed him?" "I don't know what to believe. That's why I'm here." He nodded slowly, as if this was reasonable. "I can understand your confusion. James can be very convincing, very sympathetic. That's part of what made him so effective as a con man. He's not. Let me ask you something." Garrett leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Did James ever ask you for money or access to your accounts?" "No." "Did he ever pressure you to sign documents? Make investments on his behalf?" "No." "Then you're lucky, because that's his pattern. He gains trust, integrates himself into someone's life, and then—" Garrett snapped his fingers. "Takes everything he can and disappears." Clara felt cold despite the stuffy heat of the office. "You're lying." "Am I?" Garrett opened a drawer, pulled out a file folder thick with papers. "These are depositions from his investors, families he cheated. Read them yourself." He pushed the folder across the desk. Clara opened it with trembling hands. The pages were filled with testimony, names, dates, amounts. People describing how James had convinced them to invest in land developments that never materialized. How their savings had disappeared into accounts that turned out to be fraudulent. How when they demanded answers, James had vanished. The words blurred together. She felt sick. "I know this is difficult," Garrett said softly. "But you need to understand what kind of man he is, what he's capable of." "Then why?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "Why didn't he take anything from me? I had access to money, to the inn's accounts. He could have robbed me blind and disappeared months ago." Garrett smiled, sad, knowing. "Because you had nothing worth taking. No offense, Miss Ashford, but a struggling inn in a dying town? That's not his usual target. I suspect he was simply biding his time, waiting until you built up enough resources to make it worth his while." The logic was sound, reasonable. It made sense in the way that lies sometimes do when they're built from carefully selected truths. But something in Clara's chest rebelled against it. "I don't believe you," she said. Garrett's expression hardened slightly. "Then you're a fool. And James Holloway specializes in fools." Clara stood, her legs shaking. "I want to see him. That's your right. The jail's 2 blocks east." He paused. "But Miss Ashford, when you see him, remember this, men like James don't change. They just get better at lying." She left without another word, her mind spinning, the folder of depositions clutched in her hands like evidence of her own stupidity. The jail smelled like sweat and despair. Clara stood outside James's cell, her hands gripping the bars, and tried to reconcile the man sitting on the narrow cot with the man she thought she knew. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. His hair was unkempt, his face unshaven, his clothes rumpled. But when he looked up and saw her, his eyes, those careful, guarded eyes, filled with something that looked like relief and shame and hope all tangled together. "Clara, I spoke to Garrett." James closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. "Of course you did. He showed me depositions. Testimony from people you cheated. They're lying. All of them?" "Garrett paid them off. Or threatened them. I don't know how he did it, but those depositions, they're not real." "How do you know?" "Because I didn't do what they're accusing me of." His voice rose, desperate. "Clara, you have to believe me. Garrett set this whole thing up. He falsified the records, created fake accounts in my name, and when I figured it out, he made sure I couldn't prove anything. Then prove it now. Show me evidence. Give me something besides your word." James stood, moved to the bars. His hands came up to cover hers, warm and rough and achingly familiar. "I can't. He destroyed everything. Every document, every record that could have cleared me, it's gone. All I have is my word." He squeezed her hands. "All I have is you believing in me." Clara felt tears threatening again. "That's not enough, James. Your word against his, and he has—" She gestured helplessly. "Everything. Evidence. Witnesses. Power. I know. Then what am I supposed to do? Go home." His voice cracked. "Forget about me. Live your life. That's your answer? Just give up? What else is there?" She stared at him, at the defeat in his eyes, and felt fury bloom in her chest. "Fight. That's what else. Fight for your innocence. Fight for the truth. Fight for—" She stopped, couldn't finish. "For us. But there might not be an us. Not if he was guilty. Not if everything between them had been built on lies." James seemed to read her thoughts. "You're not sure. About me. About whether I'm telling the truth." It wasn't a question. Clara wanted to deny it, wanted to say of course she believed him, that her faith was absolute. But the words wouldn't come. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. James nodded slowly, pulled his hands back. The loss of his touch felt like abandonment. "Then you should go, before I disappoint you any more than I already have." "James, please, Clara, just go." She stood there for one more moment, memorizing his face, trying to find in it the man who'd brought her wildflowers and taught children to carve wood, and held her in the kitchen like she was something precious. But all she saw was a stranger in a jail cell, and she didn't know if that was because he'd been lying all along, or because the bars between them had changed everything. She turned and walked away, his name catching in her throat like a prayer she didn't know how to pray anymore. Behind her, James sank back onto the cot and buried his face in his hands. And outside, the sun beat down on Cutter's Ridge with merciless indifference, while somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, the promise of another storm brewing on the horizon. The ride back to Salvation Creek felt longer than it should have. Clara sat rigid in the saddle, the horse moving beneath her with patient indifference while the sun tracked its slow arc across the sky. The prairie stretched endless in every direction. Gold grass and blue sky and nothing else, just vast, empty space that seemed to mirror the hollowness in her chest. She kept seeing his face, the way James had looked at her through those bars, like she was both his salvation and his executioner. The defeat in his eyes when she'd admitted her doubt. "I don't know what to believe anymore." The truth of those words sat heavy in her stomach like stones. By the time she reached the inn, evening was settling over the valley. The building stood silhouetted against the dying light, and for the first time since her mother's death, Clara looked at it and felt nothing but exhaustion. She unsaddled the horse, gave it water and feed, moved through the motions with mechanical precision. Inside, the inn was quiet. The few guests she had were either out or already in their rooms. She lit a lamp, stood in the empty kitchen, and tried to remember what it felt like when James had been here. The memory felt like something from another life. She pulled out the folder Garrett had given her, spread the depositions across the table, page after page of testimony, names and dates and accusations, all of it pointing to James's guilt with the inexorable logic of accumulated evidence. The Hendersons of Miller's Crossing invested $3,000 in a land development that never broke ground. James Holloway collected the money and disappeared. The Prescott family of Cutter's Ridge paid $5,000 for deeds to property that turned out to be already owned by someone else. Holloway forged the documents. Martha Sullivan, widow, gave her late husband's life insurance, $2,000, to Holloway for a guaranteed return. Never saw the money again. On and on. 12 families, over $40,000. All of it gone into James Holloway's pockets, if the testimony was to be believed. Clara read until her eyes burned and her head ached. Then she read again, looking for inconsistencies, for patterns, for anything that might suggest Garrett had manufactured the evidence. But if it was fake, it was expertly done. She finally pushed the papers away, dropped her head into her hands, and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She'd been such a fool, a lonely, desperate fool who'd seen what she wanted to see instead of what was real. James had shown up broken and mysterious, and she'd projected all her own needs onto him, turned him into some tragic hero when he was probably just a criminal running from justice. Mrs. Henderson had tried to warn her. Pike had practically spelled it out. Even James himself had said he didn't deserve peace, didn't deserve this life. Maybe he'd been telling the truth about that at least. Clara stood abruptly, began pacing the kitchen. She felt trapped, by doubt, by fear, by the terrible realization that she'd built her entire summer around a man who might be exactly what everyone said he was. But then, she stopped mid-stride, something nagging at the edge of her awareness. The Prescott family. She'd read that name in the depositions, but she'd also heard it somewhere else. The family who'd stayed at the inn in July. The young couple with 3 children heading west. Mrs. Prescott had thanked them both for reminding her why good people still existed. Clara rushed back to the table, flipped through the depositions until she found it. The Prescott family of Cutter's Ridge paid $5,000 for deeds to property that turned out to be already owned by someone else. But the Prescotts who'd stayed here, they'd been poor. Everything they owned had been in that wagon. They couldn't have had $5,000 to invest. Were there 2 Prescott families? Maybe. It wasn't an uncommon name, but the address listed in the deposition, Cutter's Ridge, West Street, the same address Mrs. Prescott had written in the guest book when they'd checked in. Clara's heart began to pound. It was the same family, which meant either they'd somehow had $5,000 despite appearing destitute, or the deposition was lying. She grabbed the papers again, reading with new focus, looking not at the accusations but at the details, addresses, dates, amounts, and slowly a pattern began to emerge. Several of the families listed lived in Cutter's Ridge or the immediately surrounding area, Garrett's territory. The dates of the supposed investments were all within a 6-month period 5 years ago, and the amounts, while varying, were all substantial, thousands of dollars each, the kind of money that would ruin families if they lost it, the kind of money that would make James look irredeemably guilty if people believed he'd stolen it. But if the depositions were fake, if Garrett had convinced or coerced these families to lie, then it was the perfect frame. Who would doubt a dozen witnesses all telling the same story? Clara's hands shook as she gathered the papers back into the folder. She didn't have proof yet. Just a suspicion, a thread she could pull, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. It was hope. She left before dawn, when the sky was still more black than blue and the stars were beginning to fade. This time she took the wagon. She'd need it if she was going to be traveling between multiple towns tracking down the families on Garrett's list. The horse pulled steady and strong, and Clara let her mind work through the problem like James had taught her with the ledgers. Start with what you know, build from there. What she knew, the Prescotts couldn't have invested $5,000. What she needed to know, had they actually signed that deposition, and if so, why? The Prescotts had been heading west. They'd mentioned homesteading, near the border. That meant they'd likely passed through Ridge Valley, a small settlement about 30 miles from Cutter's Ridge. It took Clara most of the day to reach it. Ridge Valley was barely a town, more a collection of supply stations and temporary camps for families on their way to somewhere else. But there was a land office, and land offices kept records. The clerk was a thin, nervous man who looked like paperwork was the only thing standing between him and total chaos. Prescott family? He repeated when Clara asked. Heading west? Yes. They would have passed through about a month ago. I need to find out where they filed their homestead claim. The clerk disappeared into a back room, returned with a leather-bound ledger. He ran his finger down the columns, muttering to himself. Here, Prescott, Andrew and Sarah, 3 children, filed for 160 acres in the Western Territory section. Looks like Township 14. Is that far? 3 days' ride, maybe. If you're determined. Clara was determined. She bought supplies, dried, meat, hardtack, a bedroll she couldn't really afford, and headed west. The land changed as she traveled. The gentle rolls of the prairie gave way to something more rugged, more wild. Scattered trees appeared, then clusters of them. The grass grew taller, less tamed. At night she made camp under stars so bright and numerous they seemed to crowd the sky, and listened to coyotes sing their lonesome songs. She'd never traveled alone like this, never been more than a day's ride from Salvation Creek. The solitude should have frightened her. Instead, it clarified something. All her life, Clara had built her identity around other people's dreams, her mother's inn, her father's memory, the expectations of the town. Even her feelings for James had been tangled up in her need to save something, to prove she wasn't failing. But out here, alone in the vast indifference of the prairie, none of that mattered. She was just Clara, one small human crossing an enormous landscape, chasing a truth that might not even exist. And somehow that felt like enough. On the third day, she found the Prescott homestead. It wasn't much yet, a half-built cabin, a cleared field, a makeshift corral with 2 horses. But she could see the dream taking shape, the life they were building from nothing but hope and stubbornness. Sarah Prescott saw her coming from a distance. By the time Clara pulled the wagon to a stop, the whole family had gathered, Andrew with an axe held loosely, Sarah with her youngest child on her hip, the older children peeking out from behind their mother's skirts. "Mrs. Prescott?" Clara climbed down, her legs stiff from days in the wagon. "I don't know if you remember me. You stayed at my inn, Mercy House, about a month ago." Recognition dawned on Sarah's face, followed immediately by confusion. "Miss Ashford? What are you doing all the way out here? I need to ask you about something." "About James Holloway." Andrew's expression hardened. "We heard he was arrested. Sheriff came by asking if we'd seen him." "Did you sign a deposition?" Clara pulled out the folder. "Saying that James swindled you out of $5,000? Sarah and Andrew exchanged glances. Something passed between them. Surprise, then understanding, then what looked like shame. "We didn't want to," Sarah said quietly. Clara's heart began to race. "But you did?" "Not exactly." Andrew set down the axe, gestured for Clara to sit. They settled on rough-hewn logs arranged around a fire pit. "About 6 months ago, a man came to us, Robert Garrett, said he was investigating fraud, that James Holloway had stolen from investors, and he was building a case." "What did he want from you?" "Our testimony. Said if we'd sign a statement saying Holloway had cheated us, he'd make sure we got compensated for our trouble." "But James never cheated you," Clara said. "No." Sarah's voice was firm. "We never invested anything with him. Never even met him until we stayed at your inn." "Then why?" "Because we were desperate." Andrew's jaw tightened. "We'd been trying to save enough to file for this land for 2 years. Garrett offered us $500 just to sign a paper saying we'd been victims. Said it wouldn't hurt anyone. Holloway was guilty anyway. They just needed the documentation." Clara felt sick. "You lied under oath for money." "We didn't think of it as lying." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Garrett made it sound like we were helping catch a real criminal. And the money, with that money, we could finally afford to leave, to give our children a real chance." She looked at Clara desperately. "We're not bad people. I know you're not." Clara's voice was gentler than she felt. "But James isn't a criminal either. And your testimony is part of what's keeping him in jail." The weight of that settled over them, like a physical presence. "We didn't know," Andrew said finally. "Garrett said it was just a formality. That Holloway would be convicted anyway based on other evidence. There is no other evidence, just depositions like yours." Clara leaned forward. "Would you be willing to recant? To tell the truth about what really happened?" Sarah looked at her husband. "If we do that, Garrett will come after us. He'll want his money back. Might even press charges for false testimony." "He might," Clara admitted. "But if you don't, an innocent man goes to prison. Maybe for years." The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind through the grass and the distant cry of a hawk. Finally, Andrew spoke. "Mr. Holloway fixed our wagon wheel, didn't ask for payment, just did it because it needed doing." He met Clara's eyes. "That's not what criminals do." "No," Clara said softly. "It's not." "We'll come with you," Sarah said. "We'll tell the truth. Whatever happens, we'll make it right." It took Clara another week to track down 3 more families. The Hendersons, who admitted Garrett had paid them to sign a deposition about an investment that never happened. The Sullivans, who'd been threatened with losing their ranch if they didn't cooperate. The Winters family, who'd been too frightened of Garrett's power to refuse. Each confession was the same. Garrett had offered money or threatened consequences, had assured them Holloway was guilty anyway, had made it seem like they were helping justice instead of perverting it. By the time Clara returned to Cutter's Ridge, she had 4 families willing to recant their testimony and a folder full of signed statements detailing Garrett's coercion. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to create doubt, enough to force a real investigation. She went straight to the courthouse, demanded to see the judge. Judge Morrison was an old man with tired eyes and the slumped shoulders of someone who'd seen too much human weakness. He listened to Clara's presentation, with the expression of a man who'd been expecting this conversation for a long time, and had been dreading it. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and sighed. "You understand what you're asking me to do, Miss Ashford? You're accusing one of the most powerful men in this county of orchestrating fraud." "I'm not accusing. I have evidence, signed statements from people who've already admitted to lying under oath. Not exactly credible witnesses. They lied because Garrett forced them to. That makes them victims, not criminals." Morrison picked up one of the statements, scanned it with weary eyes. "Even if everything you say is true, going after Garrett will be complicated. He has resources, connections, lawyers who'll tie this up in court for years. So you're just going to let him win? Let an innocent man rot in jail because it's easier than fighting?" The judge's eyes hardened. "Watch your tone, young lady." Clara took a breath, forced herself to speak calmly. "I'm sorry, but James Holloway is in that jail cell because everyone who was supposed to care about justice decided it was easier to believe a powerful man than to question him. If you don't act on this evidence, you're complicit." Morrison was silent for a long moment. Then he set down the papers and looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You care about him, Holloway." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "Yes." "Enough to stake your own reputation on his innocence?" "Yes." "Even though he lied to you about who he was?" Clara hesitated. "He didn't lie. He just didn't tell me everything." "There's a difference, is there?" The judge stood, moved to the window overlooking the square. "I knew James Holloway, Miss Ashford. Before all this, he was a good businessman. Honest, from what I could tell. When the accusations first came out, I thought he trailed off. I thought there had to be some mistake. But the evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were credible, and Garrett was very convincing. You had doubts." "I always have doubts. That's the burden of this job." He turned to face her. "But doubt isn't enough. I need proof. I just gave you proof. You gave me confessions from people who already perjured themselves. That's not the same thing." He moved back to his desk, began gathering the papers. "But it's enough to order an investigation. I'll send a marshal to interview these families, verify their statements. If everything checks out, I'll issue a stay of execution on Holloway's trial and launch a formal inquiry into Garrett's conduct." Relief flooded through Clara's chest. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning. Garrett won't go down without a fight, and when he fights, people get hurt." Morrison looked at her seriously. "You need to be prepared for that, for what might happen when he realizes you're the one who exposed him. I'm prepared. Are you? Because men like Garrett don't just destroy your reputation, Miss Ashford. They destroy everything you've built, everyone you care about. They make sure that even if they lose, you lose harder." Clara lifted her chin. "Then I'll lose, but at least I'll lose knowing I fought for the truth." The judge studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Your mother would be proud of you." The words hit Clara unexpectedly, brought tears to her eyes that she blinked away quickly. "You knew her?" "Everyone knew Margaret Ashford. She was the kind of woman who made you believe the world could be better than it was." He smiled faintly. "I see she passed that particular delusion on to you. It's not a delusion. We'll see." He gathered the papers into a neat stack, placed them in a drawer that he locked with a key from his vest. "Go home, Miss Ashford. Take care of your inn. Let me handle this. Can I see James before I go?" Morrison hesitated, then nodded. "I'll tell the jailer to let you in." James was sitting on the cot when she arrived, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and something complex passed across his face. Hope and fear and shame all tangled together. "Clara," she stood at the bars, her hands gripping the cold iron. "I spoke to the Prescotts." His eyes widened. "You what?" "And the Hendersons, and the Sullivans, and 3 other families on Garrett's list." She pulled out the folder of recantations. "They all admitted he paid them to lie. That you never swindled anyone. James stood slowly, moved to the bars like he was afraid she might disappear. How did you? I didn't believe Garrett. Something felt wrong about the depositions, so I tracked down the families and asked them myself. She met his eyes. They're willing to recant their testimony, to tell the truth. For a long moment, James just stared at her. Then his hands came up to cover hers on the bars, his grip tight enough to hurt. You did that for me? His voice broke. After everything, after I couldn't even prove my innocence, you went out and found the proof yourself? I couldn't just leave you here. Not when I knew. She stopped, swallowed hard. Not when I believed you, but you had doubts. You said, I know what I said, and yes, I had doubts, because doubt is rational when someone you care about might have lied to you. Clara squeezed his hands. But I also knew you, knew the man you are, not just the story people told about you. And that man, the one who saved me in a storm, who taught children, who brought me wildflowers. That man doesn't steal from people. He builds things, fixes things, makes the world better just by moving through it. James closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, tears tracked down his face. I don't deserve you. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. He laughed, a sound somewhere between a sob and relief. The judge, he's going to investigate? He is. And when he does, when he exposes what Garrett did, you'll be free. And then you come home. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Home, not the inn, not Salvation Creek, but wherever they were together. James pulled her hands through the bars, pressed them to his face like he was trying to memorize the feel of her skin. I'm sorry for not telling you everything from the beginning, for letting you build your life around someone who was still half broken. We're all half broken, James. That's what makes us human. Clara leaned as close as the bars would allow, and maybe that's what makes us whole. Finding someone who sees all your broken pieces and decides you're worth fighting for anyway. He looked at her with such raw emotion that she felt it like a physical touch. I love you. The words were simple, unadorned. True. Clara felt them sink into her chest, take root, bloom into something warm and permanent and utterly terrifying. I love you too, she whispered. And despite the bars between them, despite the uncertainty of what came next, despite everything they'd been through and everything they still had to face, in that moment, they were whole. She left Cutter's Ridge as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The ride home felt different than the journey out. Lighter, somehow, despite the exhaustion in her bones. She'd done what she set out to do, found the truth, exposed the lies. Now she just had to wait for justice to catch up. The prairie rolled past, endless and indifferent and beautiful. Somewhere ahead, Mercy House waited, her mother's dream, her own burden, the place she'd built into something worth preserving. And soon, if everything went right, James would be there too, not as hired help, not as a guest, but as home. Clara urged the horse into a faster pace, suddenly desperate to be back, to start preparing for his return, to clean his room and stock the pantry and make everything ready for the life they were going to build together. If she'd looked back, she might have seen the dust cloud rising in the distance behind her, might have noticed the riders following at a careful distance, might have realized that Robert Garrett hadn't built an empire by letting people expose his crimes without consequence. But she didn't look back. She just rode forward, toward home, toward hope, toward a future she finally believed might be possible. And behind her, in the gathering dusk, Garrett's men closed the distance with the patient inevitability of wolves circling prey. The smoke was visible from 3 miles away. Clara saw it first as a smudge against the evening sky, dark and wrong, rising in a column that twisted in the wind like something alive. Her hands tightened on the reins, her heart beginning to pound with a dread she couldn't name yet but felt in every nerve. She urged the horse faster. As she crested the final hill overlooking Salvation Creek, the full scope of it became clear. Fire. Not the whole town, just one building at the far end of the street, flames licking up the walls and through the roof, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Even from this distance, she could see people running with buckets, forming a chain from the well, fighting desperately to contain the blaze before it spread. Clara's breath caught. She knew which building it was before she could see it clearly. Knew with the terrible certainty of nightmare made real. Mercy House. She kicked the horse into a full gallop, the wagon forgotten, racing down the hill with a speed that was reckless and necessary. The wind tore at her hair, her dress, her scream, a sound of pure anguish that disappeared into the roar of her own terror. By the time she reached the inn, the entire west side was engulfed. Flames poured from the windows like liquid light, consuming everything. The curtains her mother had sewn, the furniture James had repaired, the walls that had sheltered travelers and memories and hope. The heat was immense, pushing back the bucket brigade, turning their faces orange and desperate. Clara threw herself off the horse, started running toward the building. Arms caught her, strong, familiar. Mrs. Henderson, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Clara, no, it's too late. Let me go." Clara fought against the grip, her voice raw. "There are guests inside. Everyone got out. I made sure. Everyone's safe. The inn, it's gone, child. I'm sorry, but it's gone." Clara stopped struggling, the words hitting her like physical blows. She stood frozen in Mrs. Henderson's arms and watched her mother's dream burn. The roof collapsed with a sound like the world breaking. Sparks exploded into the sky, and the crowd stepped back as one, defeated, their buckets useless against the inferno. The fire raged on, indifferent to their efforts, consuming decades of history in minutes. Clara sank to her knees in the dirt, unable to look away, unable to process the scope of the loss. Everything. Everything she'd worked for, everything James had repaired, everything that had made her believe a future was possible. Gone. How did it start? Her voice sounded distant, disconnected from her body. Mrs. Henderson crouched beside her, her hand on Clara's shoulder. "No one knows. Some folks said they saw riders leaving town just before the fire started. Strangers. But by the time anyone noticed the smoke, it was already too far gone. Riders. Strangers." Something cold settled in Clara's stomach beneath the shock. This wasn't an accident. She stood abruptly, scanning the crowd for a familiar face. Found him near the well, Reverend Peters, his face grim, his shirt soaked with sweat and water. "Reverend." Clara's voice came out harder than she intended. "The riders. What did they look like?" He turned to her, surprised. "Clara, I'm so sorry. What did they look like?" Something in her tone made him pause. "I didn't see them myself, but Tommy Sullivan did. Said there were 3 of them. Well-dressed. One had a gray mustache. Pike, or Garrett himself." The cold in Clara's stomach spread outward, turning to ice in her veins. This was retribution. This was what Morrison had warned her about. What happened when you exposed powerful men and made them feel threatened. Garrett had burned her in, destroyed everything she had, all because she dared to tell the truth. Clara turned back to watch the fire, and felt something shift inside her. The shock and grief were still there, would probably be there for a long time. But beneath them, something else was rising, something hard and bright and utterly uncompromising. Rage. Not the hot, explosive kind, the cold, calculating kind. The kind that didn't scream or cry or collapse, the kind that planned. "Mrs. Henderson," Clara said quietly, "I need to borrow your horse." "What? Why?" "I'm going back to Cutter's Ridge. Now?" "Clara, you're in shock. You need to rest I need to finish this." Clara met the older woman's eyes. "Garrett did this, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Mrs. Henderson's face paled. "You can't accuse Robert Garrett of arson. He'll destroy you." "He already has." Clara gestured at the burning building. "There's nothing left for him to take. Your life isn't worth living if I have to spend it being afraid of men who think they can do whatever they want without consequences." She walked away before Mrs. Henderson could respond, moving through the crowd with single-minded purpose. People reached out to her, offered condolences, tried to stop her. She ignored them all. At the edge of town, she found her horse, still standing where she'd left it, and climbed back into the saddle despite her exhaustion, despite the way her hands shook, despite everything. She had work to do. The ride to Cutter's Ridge took all night. Clara pushed the horse as hard as she dared, stopping only briefly to let it rest and water. The moon rose full and bright, turning the prairie silver, illuminating her path with cold, indifferent light. She didn't let herself think about what she'd lost, didn't let herself imagine her mother's face if she could see the inn now, reduced to ash and timber and the ghost of what it had been. Instead, she thought about James, about the way he'd looked at her through those bars, his hands holding hers like she was the only real thing in a world of lies, about the empire Garrett had stolen from him, The business, the reputation, the future. About the fact that Garrett was still free, still powerful, still winning. Not anymore. By the time Clara reached Cutter's Ridge, dawn was breaking over the eastern hills. The town was just waking. Shopkeepers opening shutters, early risers heading to work. She rode straight to the courthouse, tied her horse to the rail, and walked up the steps like she had every right to be there. Judge Morrison's clerk tried to stop her. "Miss Ashford, the judge isn't seeing anyone until—" Clara walked past him, opened Morrison's door without knocking. The judge looked up from his breakfast, surprise flashing across his face. "Miss Ashford, I wasn't expecting—" "Robert Garrett burned down my inn last night." Morrison went very still. "You have proof?" Witnesses saw 3 riders leaving town just before the fire started. One matched Garrett's description. Another matched Sheriff Pike. She moved to his desk, planted her hands on it. "This is retaliation. He's trying to silence me before your investigation can go forward. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth." Morrison set down his fork slowly. "Even if it is, arson is difficult to prove. Without direct evidence, then get evidence. Send your marshal to Salvation Creek. Question the witnesses. Search Garrett's property for anything that might connect him to the fire." Clara leaned forward. "Or are you going to let him get away with this too?" The judge's eyes hardened. "Watch yourself, Miss Ashford." "No." The word came out flat, final. "I'm done watching myself. I'm done being careful. I'm done letting powerful men do whatever they want because fighting back is too hard or too dangerous or too complicated." Her voice rose. "He burned down my home, the place my mother built, the life I was trying to save. And if you don't do something about it, then you're just as guilty as he is." Silence filled the office, heavy and tense. Then Morrison stood, his expression unreadable. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Ashford. I'm done caring which." He studied her for a long moment, then moved to the door. "Jenkins," he called to his clerk. "Send for Marshal Reeves. Tell him I need him immediately." He turned back to Clara. "You'll need to give a full statement. Names of witnesses, timeline of events, anything else that might be relevant. I'll tell you everything, and you understand that if this goes to trial, you'll be called as a witness, that Garrett's lawyers will tear apart your credibility, your reputation, everything about you. I understand, and you're willing to do this anyway, even knowing what it might cost." Clara thought about James in that jail cell, about her mother's dream turned to ash, about all the people Garrett had hurt and would continue hurting if someone didn't stop him. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." Morrison nodded slowly. "Then sit down. This is going to take a while." The statement took 3 hours. Clara laid out everything, the investigation into the false depositions, the families who'd recanted, the threats Morrison had warned her about, the fire itself. She gave names, dates, details, held nothing back. When she finally finished, her throat was raw, and her hands ached from clenching them so tightly in her lap. Marshal Reeves, a lean, weathered man with intelligent eyes, read through the statement carefully. "This is explosive, Judge. I know. If even half of it's true, Garrett's going down, and he won't go quietly. I know that too." Reeves turned to Clara. "You got somewhere safe to stay, Miss Ashford? Because once Garrett hears about this investigation, and he will hear about it, you're going to be a target." "I have nowhere to stay," Clara said flatly. "My inn burned down, remember? You can stay at the boarding house," Morrison said. "I'll cover the cost. Consider it protective custody." "I don't need protection." "Yes, you do, and you're going to accept it because I'm not having your death on my conscience." His tone left no room for argument. Clara wanted to fight, but exhaustion was finally catching up with her. She nodded mutely. Reeves stood. "I'll head to Salvation Creek, start interviewing witnesses." "Judge, you want me to bring in Garrett for questioning?" "Not yet. Gather the evidence first. I want this case airtight before we move on him." Morrison looked at Clara. "In the meantime, you stay out of sight. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't talk to anyone about the case." "Understood. Can I see James?" Morrison hesitated. "I suppose that's safe enough, but only in the jail, with guards present." It wasn't what she wanted, but it was better than nothing. She let them lead her to the boarding house, let the proprietor, a kind older woman named Mrs. Chen, show her to a small, clean room. Left her there with instructions to rest, to stay put. to let the law handle things. Clara waited exactly 20 minutes after they left. Then she climbed out the window and headed for the jail. James was asleep when she arrived. He was curled on his side on the narrow cot, his face turned toward the wall, his breathing deep and even. For a moment, Clara just stood there watching him, memorizing the curve of his shoulder, the way his hair fell across his forehead. Then she whispered his name. His eyes opened immediately, the reaction of a man who'd learned to sleep lightly, to wake ready. He saw her and sat up so fast he nearly hit his head on the low ceiling. Clara. She moved to the bars, her hands wrapping around the cold iron. I'm sorry. I know they said I shouldn't come, but I had to see you. What happened? He was on his feet now, moving to her, his eyes scanning her face with increasing alarm. You look, what's wrong? She told him. All of it. The fire, the destruction, the confrontation with Morrison, the statement she'd given. James listened with an expression that cycled through shock, horror, and finally a rage so pure it made him shake. He burned down your inn. It wasn't a question. Because of me. Because you tried to help me. Not because of you. Because of him. Because he's a monster who destroys anything that threatens his power. Same result. James's hands came up to grip the bars near hers, his knuckles white. Clara, you have to stop. You have to walk away from this before... Before what? Before he hurts me worse. James, he already took everything. There's nothing left to threaten me with. There's you. There's your life. His voice broke. If something happened to you because of me, I couldn't... Nothing's going to happen to me. You don't know that. I know that I'm not backing down. I know that Garrett is going to pay for what he's done. To you, to me, to everyone he's hurt. She squeezed his hands through the bars. And I know that when this is over, when you're free and he's in a cell where he belongs, we're going to rebuild. Not just the inn. Everything. James stared at her like she'd lost her mind. With what money? What resources? Clara, you have nothing left. I have the truth. And I have you. She met his eyes. That's enough. For a long moment he just looked at her, his expression caught somewhere between despair and awe. Then he pulled her hands through the bars and pressed them to his chest, over his heart. When I lost everything before, he said quietly, thought my life was over. Thought there was nothing left worth fighting for. Then I met you, and you made me believe that maybe I could build something again. Something small and honest and good. His voice roughened. But this, what you're doing for me, Clara, this isn't small. This is everything. And I don't know how to... He stopped, couldn't finish. You don't have to know. You just have to trust me. I do trust you. That's what terrifies me. She understood. Understood that trust, after betrayal, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. James, she said softly, do you remember that first night, when you came to my door in the storm? Every detail. I asked you to come in, and you hesitated, like you were deciding whether to stay or keep running. She squeezed his hands. You chose to stay. You chose to build something. You chose to hope even when hoping felt impossible. She leaned as close as the bars allowed. Now I'm asking you to do it again. Choose to hope. Choose to believe that we're going to win this. That justice is possible. That the future we want is worth fighting for. James closed his eyes, his jaw working. When he opened them again, something had shifted. Some decision made, some internal barrier broken. Okay, he whispered. Okay. She smiled, and even through her exhaustion and grief, it felt real. They stood there in the quiet of the jail, holding on to each other through iron bars, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. This was right. Fighting was right. Believing was right. Even if it cost her everything, even if Garrett destroyed her completely, at least she'd go down swinging. At least she'd know she'd tried. The trial began 1 week later. Not James's trial. He was released on Morrison's order pending investigation. But Robert Garrett's, the marshal's investigation, had moved with surprising speed. Witnesses in Salvation Creek identified 2 of Garrett's known associates as the riders who'd left town before the fire. A stable hand in Cutter's Ridge confirmed that Garrett had purchased lamp oil, far more than any household would need, the day before. And most damning, a bank clerk came forward with records showing massive transfers from Garrett's accounts to each of the families who'd given false testimony against James. Evidence of bribery, evidence of fraud, evidence of a conspiracy to frame an innocent man. The courthouse was packed. Clara sat in the front row, James beside her, their hands clasped tightly. Across the aisle, Robert Garrett sat in expensive clothes with expensive lawyers, his face arranged in an expression of wounded dignity. But his eyes, when they found Clara, burned with pure hatred. She met his gaze steadily and didn't look away. The trial lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony and evidence and legal arguments. The families who'd been coerced told their stories. Marshall Reeves presented the financial records. A handwriting expert testified that documents supposedly signed by James were actually forged. Garrett's lawyers fought hard, argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the witnesses were unreliable, that James himself was still guilty, and this was all a desperate attempt to shift blame. But the truth was too substantial, too documented, too undeniable. On the afternoon of the third day, the jury returned, guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, attempted arson, destruction of property. The courtroom erupted. Garrett's lawyers immediately filed appeals. Morrison banged his gavel, calling for order, his face grim but satisfied, and Clara just sat there, her hand in James's, and felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest for months finally release. It was over. Sentencing came a week later. Garrett received 15 years, a harsh sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and Morrison's desire to send a message. His assets were seized, to be liquidated and distributed as restitution to his victims, which meant James, who had lost his company, his reputation, his entire life, was getting it back. Not the same life, not the same company, but the financial means to rebuild, to start over, to reclaim what had been stolen. Morrison called them both to his chambers after the sentencing. "Mr. Holloway," the judge said, his tone formal, "I owe you an apology. I should have investigated more thoroughly when the initial accusations were made, should have questioned the evidence instead of accepting it at face value. Because I failed to do my job, you spent 5 years as a fugitive. That's on me." James was quiet for a moment. "Then, you believed what you were told. That's not a crime. It's human. It's also how innocent people get destroyed." Morrison turned to Clara. "Miss Ashford, you showed more courage and integrity than most people see in a lifetime. Your mother would be proud. Hell, I'm proud, and I barely know you." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. As for restitution, Garrett's assets are substantial. The court will distribute funds to all his documented victims, which includes you, Mr. Holloway. Given the scope of what he stole from you, you're looking at significant compensation." James shook his head slowly, like he couldn't quite process it. "How much?" Morrison consulted his papers. "Approximately $200,000. The number hung in the air like something impossible. James actually laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. That's more than the company was ever worth. Garrett built quite the empire on the foundation of what he stole from you. This is your share." Morrison looked between them. "What will you do with it?" James turned to Clara. She saw in his eyes a question, an offer, a promise. "We're going to rebuild," James said. "Everything he destroyed, and then some." They returned to Salvation Creek 2 days later. The ruins of Mercy House still stood, blackened timber and collapsed walls, the skeleton of what had been. Clara stood looking at it, James beside her, and tried to feel something besides exhaustion. "It's gone," she said quietly. "The building is. But the idea, what it stood for, that's still here." James squeezed her hand. "We can rebuild it, better than before, bigger, strong enough to withstand anything." "With what? Your restitution money?" "Our money." He turned to face her fully. "Clara, everything I have, everything I'm getting back, it's only because of you. Because you believed in me when everyone else thought I was guilty. Because you fought for me when I'd given up fighting for myself." He took both her hands. "I want to rebuild this inn, but not as mine, as ours." She stared at him, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "James, I know it's fast. I know we've barely had time to breathe, let alone plan a future. But I also know that I love you, that I want to build a life with you, that everything I do from now on, I want to do with you beside me." He took a breath. "So I'm asking, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the faith you showed in me?" Clara felt tears start to fall, not from sadness or exhaustion, but from something simpler and more profound. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated, overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." He pulled her into his arms, held her with a grip that said he'd never let go, and she felt everything that had been broken start to knit back together. Not perfectly, not without scars, but whole enough, strong enough, real enough. Around them the town was waking. People emerged from buildings drawn by the sight of James and Clara standing in the ruins. Mrs. Henderson, Reverend Peters, the families who'd lived and worked here for generations. They gathered slowly, forming a circle around the burned inn, and in their faces Clara saw something she'd almost stopped believing in. Community. Folks, James said, his voice carrying clear across the yard. This inn is going to be rebuilt, better than before, and when it is, it's going to be a place that lives up to its name, a place of mercy, a place where anyone who needs help can find it. He looked at Clara. That's what Margaret Ashford built. That's what her daughter fought to preserve. And that's what we're going to restore. Silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. Count me in. Whatever you need. Reverend Peters nodded. The church will contribute labor, materials if we can. One by one, the townspeople pledged their help, money, time, skills, whatever they could offer. Because this wasn't just about rebuilding an inn. It was about proving that goodness could survive, that justice was possible, that people who fought for what was right could win. Clara stood in James's arms, surrounded by her community, looking at the ruins of her past and the foundation of her future, and felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Hope, not the desperate kind, the earned kind, the kind built on truth and work and the collective will of people who decided that the world could be better if they made it so. That evening, as the sun set over the prairie, James and Clara walked to the hill overlooking town, the same hill where they'd stood months ago, when James was still deciding whether to stay, when the future was uncertain and fragile. Now it was different. Not certain, nothing was ever certain, but possible, real, within reach. You know, James said quietly, when I first came here I thought I was looking for a place to hide, somewhere to disappear until I figured out how to live with what I'd lost. And now? He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. Now I know I was looking for home. I just didn't realize it until I found you. Clara leaned into him, let his arms come around her, and watched the sky turn from gold to crimson to deep, endless blue. Behind them, Salvation Creek settled into evening. Smoke rose from chimneys, the good kind, the kind that meant warmth and food and life continuing despite everything. And in the ruins of Mercy House, already, people had begun to clear away debris, to sort through what could be salvaged, to lay the groundwork for what would come next. An empire built not on lies and stolen dreams, but on truth and shared labor and the stubborn insistence that love could rebuild what hate had destroyed. James held her as the first stars appeared, and Clara felt the last weight lift from her shoulders. They'd won, not perfectly, not without cost, but they'd won. And tomorrow, they'd begin the work of building something new, something lasting, something worthy of the people who'd fought for it, and the dreams that had survived, despite everything. In the distance, a coyote sang its evening song. The prairie whispered in the wind, and two people who'd been broken and lost found each other in the gathering dark and held on tight, knowing that together they could face whatever came next. Because that's what hope was. Not the belief that everything would be easy, but the belief that even when things were hard, even when the world tried to break you, some things were worth fighting for, and some people were worth believing in, always. Spring came gently to the prairie like something that had learned patience. The snow melted first in patches, dark earth showing through white, then spreading, then overtaking until only the shadowed hollows held on to winter. The grass began its slow transformation from brown to green, each blade reaching upward with the quiet determination of things that knew how to survive. And in the cottonwoods along the creek, buds swelled and burst, releasing leaves so new they were nearly translucent in the morning light. Clara stood on the hill overlooking Salvation Creek and watched the sun rise over a landscape transformed. The town below looked different than it had 6 months ago. New buildings had risen, a proper schoolhouse where the old sheriff's office had stood, a larger mercantile, homes for families who'd heard there was work and hoped to be found here. And at the far end of the street, dominating the skyline in a way the old building never had, stood the new Mercy House. 3 stories of honey-colored timber and river stone. Wide porches wrapped around the first floor, already furnished with rocking chairs where guests could sit and watch the prairie roll away to forever. Windows, so many windows, catching the morning light and throwing it back doubled. And above the double front doors, a sign carved from oak and painted in careful letters, Mercy House, EST 1873, rebuilt 1879. M. Ashford and J. Holloway, proprietors. Clara felt arms wrap around her from behind, a chin resting on her shoulder. "You're up early," James said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Couldn't stay in bed. Too much to do. It's opening day. Everything's ready. What if it's not? What if we forgot something important? What if no one comes?" James turned her gently to face him, his hands cupping her face with the tenderness that still made her breath catch, even after 6 months of marriage. "Clara, look at me." She met his eyes, those careful storm-gray eyes that had learned to hold hope again. "Everything is ready," he said. "We've checked it 17 times. And people will come because we built something worth coming to. A place that honors your mother's memory and gives travelers what they need most, which is kindness, rest, the belief that the world isn't entirely made of hard edges and harder hearts." He smiled. "Sound familiar?" She leaned into him, let his warmth steady her nerves. "I just want it to be perfect. It will be. Not because everything goes according to plan, but because we built it together. Because every nail and board and stone was placed with care and intention." He kissed her forehead. "That's all anyone can ask for." Below them, the town was beginning to wake, smoke rising from chimneys, doors opening, the sound of Mrs. Henderson's voice calling to someone carrying clear in the still morning air. "We should get back," Clara said. "Help with breakfast. In a minute." James held her there, looking out over the valley as the sun climbed higher. "I want to remember this. Before it all starts. Just this moment. You and me and everything we built." Clara turned in his arms, wrapped her own around his waist, and held on. "I love you. I love you too." He said it simply, the way he said everything important, without flourish, without doubt, just truth. They stood there as the world woke around them. Two people who'd been broken and lost and had somehow found their way to this hill, this morning, this life that neither of them had planned but both had fought for with everything they had. Then, hand in hand, they walked back down to begin. The kitchen of the new Mercy House was 3 times the size of the old one. Clara had designed it herself, sketching plans by lamplight while James made suggestions and adjustments. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface already crowded with pots and pans. Windows above the work counter let in eastern light. And in the center, a large table where staff could gather, where children could do homework while parents worked, where community could form in the spaces between cooking and eating. Right now, that table was controlled chaos. Mrs. Henderson rolled out biscuit dough with the efficiency of long practice. Her daughter, Emma, hired as the inn's first official employee, chopped vegetables for the midday meal. And at the stove, Reverend Peters's wife, Anne, stirred a pot of porridge while consulting a recipe card. "Clara," Anne called as they entered. "How much cinnamon did your mother use in the porridge?" "Enough that you could smell it from the front room, but not so much it burned your tongue." "That's not helpful." "It's exactly helpful. Trust your instincts." James moved to the stove, lifted the lid on another pot, nodded approval. He'd become a surprisingly good cook over the winter, learning beside Clara in the temporary kitchen they'd set up in the church basement while construction continued. Now he moved through this space with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, checking, adjusting, making sure all the pieces fit together. "First guests are arriving," Emma announced, looking out the window. "Wagon just pulled up." Clara's stomach flipped. "Already? It's not even 7. Early risers. Should I greet them?" "No." Clara took a breath, smoothed her apron. "I will. It's opening day. I should be the one to welcome them." James squeezed her shoulder as she passed. "You've got this." She walked through the doorway into the front room and stopped, just for a moment, to take it all in. The new Mercy House was beautiful in a way the old one never had been, not because they'd spent Garrett's money lavishly, but because they'd built with intention. Every detail had been considered. The wide plank floors, smooth and warm beneath bare feet. The stone fireplace, large enough to heat the whole room, with a mantel carved by a craftsman from Cutter's Ridge. Furniture built to last, solid chairs, tables that wouldn't wobble, a desk by the door where guests could sign the register. And on the walls, photographs. Clara's mother as a young woman, standing in front of the original inn, James and Clara on their wedding day, surrounded by the whole town. The construction crew who'd rebuilt this place, their faces proud and tired, a visual history of loss and rebuilding, preserved so no one would forget what it took to create something worth having. Clara moved to the front door and opened it. A family stood on the porch. Man, woman, 2 children who looked travel-worn and hopeful in equal measure. The man held his hat in his hands, his posture that of someone expecting to be turned away. "We saw your sign on the road," he said. "Says you're opening today. We were hoping, that is, if you have room." "We have room," Clara said, stepping aside. "Welcome to Mercy House." The relief on their faces was immediate and profound. They came inside slowly, the children's eyes wide as they took in the space. The woman's hand went to her throat, touching a small cross hanging there. "It's lovely," she whispered. "Thank you. I'm Clara Holloway. My husband and I run the inn. Robert Chambers. This is my wife, Mary, and our children, Joseph and Sarah." He glanced around. "How much for a room? We don't have much, but $2 a night includes all meals." His face fell slightly. "I see. We might only be able to afford one night then." Clara studied them. The worn clothes, the thin faces, the wagon outside packed with everything they owned. Heading west like so many others, chasing a dream that might or might not be possible. "Tell you what," she said. "Opening day special. $1 per night for families traveling to Homestead. We couldn't. You can and you will. Consider it an investment in the future. You build your homestead, maybe someday you'll tell other travelers about the inn that helped you along the way." Mary Chambers's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. You don't know what this means." But Clara did know, knew what it felt like to be fighting for something with everything you had and barely holding on. Knew the difference one act of kindness could make. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you to your room. Then breakfast will be ready in about 20 minutes. She led them upstairs, showed them to one of the family rooms. 2 beds, a washstand, windows overlooking the prairie. Left them to settle in, and returned to the kitchen where James was plating food. He looked up when she entered, read her expression, and smiled. Gave them the discount? Opening day special. How many more opening day specials are you planning? As many as necessary." He moved to her, kissed her temple. "We're going to go broke feeding every struggling family that comes through here. Probably good." He handed her a plate. "Your mother would approve." By midday the inn was full, the Chambers family in room 3. A traveling salesman in room 5. An elderly couple celebrating their anniversary in the best room on the 3rd floor. 2 ranch hands sharing room 7, content to split the cost and have actual beds for a night instead of bedrolls on hard ground. Clara moved through the building in a state of controlled chaos, greeting guests, answering questions, making sure everyone had what they needed. James worked alongside her, carrying luggage, fixing a sticky door, showing a guest where to stable his horse. And in the kitchen, the staff kept food coming. Breakfast blending into midday meal blending into preparations for supper. The smell of fresh bread and coffee and roasting meat filled the building, drew people to the dining room like a welcome they hadn't known they'd been seeking. At 2 o'clock, Clara finally stole a moment to collapse into one of the porch rockers. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee, handed one over, and settled into the adjacent chair. "Busy day." "Understatement," Clara said. "You look happy." Clara considered that, testing the truth of it. "I am. Tired, overwhelmed, terrified I'm going to forget something critical. But yes, happy. Your mother would be proud, you know. What you've built here, it's more than just a bigger building. It's a testament. To her dream, yes, but also to your refusal to let that dream die even when everything tried to kill it." Clara felt her throat tighten. "I couldn't have done it without help. None of us do anything worth doing without help. That's not weakness, that's wisdom." Mrs. Henderson sipped her coffee. "James is good for you." "He is. Never thought I'd say that about a man who showed up anonymous in a storm. But watching him, watching the 2 of you together, it's clear. You make each other better." Clara looked through the window into the front room where James was talking to the elderly couple, his manner patient and kind as he recommended places they might want to visit during their stay. "He saved me," Clara said quietly. "Not just from the carriage, from giving up, from believing that loss was all I had left to look forward to. And you saved him right back. That's how it's supposed to work." Mrs. Henderson stood, collected the empty cups. "Now come on. Those dishes won't wash themselves, and I have a feeling supper's going to be even busier than breakfast." She was right. By evening, 3 more travelers had arrived, and the dining room was packed. Clara and Emma served while James and Anne kept food coming from the kitchen. The room filled with the sound of conversation, laughter, the clink of silverware on plates. This was what the inn was supposed to be. Not just lodging, but community. A place where strangers could become neighbors, if only for a night. Where the isolation of the prairie could be held back by warmth and food and the simple reminder that humanity existed beyond the endless grass and sky. Clara paused in the doorway between dining room and kitchen, just watching. The Chambers children eating with the enthusiasm of kids who'd been hungry too long. The elderly couple holding hands across the table. The ranch hands swapping stories with the salesman. Mrs. Henderson moving between tables, refilling coffee, asking after people's journeys. And James, emerging from the kitchen with another platter, catching her eye across the room and smiling, small and private, and meant just for her. This was worth everything they'd endured, every loss, every fight, every moment when giving up seemed easier than continuing. All of it led here, to this room, this evening, this life they'd built from ash and determination and the stubborn belief that goodness could survive if you fought for it. After supper, after the dishes were washed, and the guests had retreated to their rooms or the porch, Clara finally had a moment to breathe. She walked outside and found James standing by the fence line, looking toward the hill where they'd watched the sunrise. The sky was deepening into twilight, the first stars just becoming visible. "Successful first day?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "I'd say so. Everyone fed, everyone happy, no disasters yet. The night's still young." He laughed softly. "Ever the optimist. I learned it from you. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the day fade. In the distance, a nighthawk called. Closer, crickets began their evening chorus. The prairie settling into its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human concerns, but somehow comforting in that indifference. "James?" Clara said after a while. Are you happy?" He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You have to ask. I want to hear you say it." He took her hand, laced their fingers together. "I'm happy. More than I ever thought I'd be again. More than I probably deserve. You deserve all of it. Maybe. Or maybe I just got lucky. Stumbled into a storm and found the one person stubborn enough to believe in me when I'd stopped believing in myself." Clara squeezed his hand. "It wasn't luck. It was choice. You chose to save me. I chose to let you stay. We chose to fight when it would have been easier to give up." She leaned against him. "That's not luck. That's will. Our will, then." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Our choice. Our life. Together." "Together," he agreed. They stood there until the stars crowded the sky and the lights in the inn's windows glowed like promises against the dark, until the evening chill sent them inside, to the warmth and the life they built, to the work that would begin again tomorrow and every day after. Inside, the inn was settling. Quiet conversations on the porch. A child laughing somewhere upstairs. The creak of floorboards as people prepared for bed. James and Clara moved through their final checks, making sure the front door was locked, the lamps properly extinguished, everything safe and secure for the night. Then they climbed the stairs to their own room on the 3rd floor, the small space they'd carved out for themselves above the bustle and business. Clara stood at the window, looking out over the town. From here she could see everything: the main street, the church, the schoolhouse, the shapes of people's lives arranged in buildings and streets and the spaces between. "What are you thinking?" James asked, coming to stand behind her. "That 6 months ago, I was standing in the ruins of everything I'd tried to build, convinced I'd lost, convinced Garrett had won, and now I'm standing in something better than what burned down. Not because it's bigger or fancier, but because we built it together, because it means something more than just shelter and food." She turned to face him. "We built a place that proves people can survive the worst things and still create something beautiful." James cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "You did that. I just helped. No, we did it. Together. And we're going to keep doing it." She placed her hands over his. "Building, creating, showing people that mercy isn't weakness, that kindness isn't foolish, that the world can be better if enough people decide to make it so." He kissed her then, soft and slow and full of everything words couldn't hold. Promise and gratitude and love, and the bone-deep relief of two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and decided to hold on. When they finally pulled apart, Clara rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For appearing in that storm, for staying when you wanted to run, for believing that broken things could be mended. Thank you for seeing something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." They stood there in the quiet of their room, holding each other while the night deepened and the inn dreamed around them. And outside, the prairie wind whispered through new grass, carrying the scent of spring and possibility and the thousand small promises that come with each new season. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters when travelers were few and money was tight. There were sick guests who needed tending and repairs that came at the worst possible times. There were disagreements and exhaustion, and moments when the weight of running the inn felt too heavy to carry. But there were also victories. The Chambers family returned from their homestead after 5 years, successful and grateful, bringing their children to show them the place that had helped them when they had nothing. Tommy Sullivan, now nearly grown, hired as the inn's handyman, learning from James the same patient skills James had once taught him as a boy. The annual Harvest Festival, held in Mercy House's front yard, bringing the whole county together for food and music, and the celebration of another year survived. And children. First a daughter, born in the room where Clara's mother had once slept, with hair as dark as James's and eyes as determined as Clara's. They named her Margaret, and she grew up running through the inn's hallways, learning hospitality and kindness, the way other children learned their letters. Then a son, quieter, more thoughtful, born on a winter morning when snow transformed the prairie into something magical. They named him Samuel, after James's father. The first time James had spoken his father's name aloud in years, the children grew up in a house filled with strangers who became friends, in a building that taught them the world was bigger than themselves, but that their kindness could still make a difference. They learned to set tables and make beds and greet travelers with smiles, learned that everyone who came through those doors carried their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams, learned what their grandmother had known and their parents had proven, that mercy was not weakness, but the hardest and most necessary strength. 20 years after the new Mercy House opened, Clara stood on the same hill where she and James had watched the sunrise on opening day. James stood beside her, his hair now silver at the temples, his hands rough from decades of work. But his eyes, those careful, storm-gray eyes, still held the same warmth when he looked at her. Below them, the town had grown. More buildings, more people, more life than that struggling settlement had ever held before. And at its heart, the inn, weathered now, worn by time and use, but still standing, still welcoming, still living up to its name. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked. "Giving up the chance to rebuild your company? To be what you were before?" James considered the question seriously. "No, what I was before, that was built on ambition and the belief that success meant accumulation, money, land, property." He gestured at the valley. "This is built on something else, on the belief that success means leaving the world better than you found it, that the measure of a life isn't what you own, but who you help." "That's very philosophical. I've had time to think about it." He smiled. "And I've had a good teacher." Below they could see their children. Margaret helping unload a wagon, Samuel carrying luggage for an elderly guest. The next generation, learning the same lessons, continuing the same work. "They're going to be fine," James said, reading her thoughts. "I know. It's just, you want to make sure the work continues. That what your mother started doesn't end with us." "Yes, it won't. We've built something that matters. And we've taught them why it matters. That's all any of us can do. Pass on what we've learned and trust the next generation to carry it forward in their own way." Clara leaned into him, let his arm come around her shoulders. "When did you get so wise?" "When I stopped running and started paying attention." They stood there as the sun climbed higher, warming the spring morning, and Clara felt the passage of time like something tangible, all the days and years that had brought them from that storm to this moment. All the choices and chances and stubborn persistence that had transformed loss into legacy. "James, I'd do it all again. Every hard part, every scary moment, every time I wanted to give up but didn't." She looked up at him. "I'd do it all again if it meant ending up here, with you, with this life." He kissed the top of her head. "Me too." And in that simple exchange was everything that mattered, not grand declarations or dramatic gestures, Just two people who'd found each other in the dark and chosen, every day, to keep choosing each other, to keep building, to keep believing that love and work and persistence could create something worth having. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wild sage and new grass. In the distance, a meadowlark sang, and from the inn below, the sound of voices and laughter and life continuing rose like music. Clara closed her eyes and listened to it all, the symphony of ordinary miracles that made up a life well lived. This was the empire James had built for her. Not made of land or money or power, but of something far more valuable and far more lasting. Made of mornings like this one, standing on a hill overlooking a community that thrived because two people had decided that mercy and kindness and stubborn hope were worth fighting for. Made of children who'd learned that the world needed tending and that their hands could do the tending. Made of travelers who'd found rest and strangers who'd found welcome and broken people who'd found proof that redemption was possible. Made of 20 years of small choices that added up to a life of meaning. Made of love. "Come on," James said gently. "Margaret's making breakfast and you know how she gets if we're late." Clara laughed, let him lead her back down the hill toward the inn, toward their family, toward the work that would begin again today and every day after. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. The prairie stretched away in every direction, gold and green and impossibly vast. And in the valley, Mercy House stood tall and welcoming, its windows catching the light, its doors open to anyone who needed what it offered. Not just shelter, not just food, but the reminder, simple and profound and necessary, that in a world that could be hard and cruel and unforgiving, there were still places where kindness lived. Still people who believed that what you built mattered more than what you owned. Still love strong enough to transform loss into legacy and pain into purpose. Clara and James walked hand in hand through the tall grass, moving toward the life they'd chosen and the home they'd built and the ordinary extraordinary miracle of another day together. Behind them, the hill stood empty and patient, waiting for the next generation to climb it and look out over the valley and marvel at what determination and hope and stubborn love could create. And ahead, in the inn that bore her mother's dream and their shared labor, breakfast was waiting, the doors were open, the world was waking. And mercy, that most radical and necessary of human impulses, was alive and well and being practiced by two people who'd learned that the only empire worth building was the one that sheltered others. The only success worth having was the kind measured in lives touched, hearts mended, strangers made welcome. The only legacy that mattered was the proof, lived out in ordinary days and extraordinary kindness, that broken things could be made whole, that lost people could find home, that love, patient, persistent, imperfect, and utterly essential, could rebuild anything, even empires, even hearts, even hope itself.